Hello, welcome to the channel. Before starting the story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very important to me. Also, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Click the like button. All of this because Mia stood in the small kitchen of her apartment, the sun filtering through the window and casting warm beams of light across the floor. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of the pine-scented candle she had burning on the countertop. Her gear lay sprawled across the cramped living room, a chaotic assortment of climbing ropes, carabiners, and weathered maps. Each item represented a small piece of the adventure that awaited her in Glacier National Park, Montana, a place she had dreamed of exploring for years. "Okay, Mia, you've got this," she whispered to herself, a mantra that resonated through her mind as she meticulously checked her gear. The thrill of climbing always surged through her veins, a mixture of adrenaline and serenity that seemed to become harder to find in the bustle of everyday life. She had always sought solace in the mountains, where the air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. She tightened the straps of her backpack, ensuring everything was secure, her fingers brushing over the smooth metal of her climbing tools. "Just you and the wild," she murmured, a smile creeping across her face as she felt the excitement bubbling within her. The mountains had always been her refuge, a place where she could escape the chaos of the world and confront her fears in their rawest form. With one last look around her apartment, Mia grabbed her keys and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting her like a refreshing wave. The city buzzed with life, but she felt detached from it all, her mind already wandering to the vast wilderness that awaited her. She climbed into her car, the engine roaring to life as she pulled away from the curb, the urban landscape quickly fading into the rearview mirror. As she drove, her anticipation grew with every mile. The road wound through valleys and hills, the scenery shifting from concrete to lush greenery. The towering mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with white, beckoning her closer. She could almost hear the whispers of the wilderness calling her name. Arriving at Glacier National Park, Mia parked her car and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp, clean air. The vibrant hues of green and blue enveloped her as she stepped out, the towering trees standing like ancient sentinels around her. She could feel the weight of the world lifting off her shoulders as she strapped on her backpack and began her ascent into the wild. The trail was challenging, winding steeply upward, but Mia relished the burn in her legs and the rhythm of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Each step brought her deeper into the heart of the park, where nature's beauty unfolded before her eyes in breathtaking vistas. The sound of a nearby waterfall danced through the air, and the chirping of birds provided a natural symphony that accompanied her journey. "Just me and the mountains," she said aloud, her voice barely more than a whisper against the backdrop of nature. The solitude was intoxicating, a welcome escape from the noise of everyday life. She felt alive, invigorated by the challenge that lay ahead. As she climbed higher, the terrain became more rugged, the path narrowing as it hugged the cliffside. Mia paused to catch her breath, her gaze sweeping across the valley below. The landscape was unlike anything she had ever seen, an expansive tapestry of greens and blues, dotted with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Suddenly, a chilling sound pierced the tranquility of the moment, a cry for help that sent shivers down her spine. It echoed through the canyon, a haunting resemblance to her own voice, and she froze mid-step, her heart racing. The sound reverberated in her ears, leaving her disoriented and unsure. "Mia." The voice called again, and she stumbled dangerously close to the edge of the cliff, panic surging through her. She steadied herself, gripping a nearby rock, her breath caught in her throat. What the hell was that? She muttered, glancing around as if the trees might provide an answer. Just the wind, she reasoned, though doubt gnawed at her. The wilderness could play tricks on the mind, and she had read enough stories to know that isolation could lead to illusions. Yet, the sound had felt so real, so visceral, as if a piece of her was desperately reaching out from the shadows. After a moment of hesitation, Mia shook her head, trying to dispel the fear that clung to her. "You're fine, Mia. Just keep going," she urged herself, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. She took a deep breath, steadying her racing heart, and continued her ascent, though the echo of the cry lingered in her mind, a ghostly reminder of uncertainty. The higher she climbed, the more the landscape transformed around her. Jagged rocks jutted out, and patches of snow clung stubbornly to crevices, remnants of winter's hold on the mountain. The air grew cooler, and the silence became palpable, broken only by the sound of her own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. As she reached a particularly steep section, Mia paused to take in the view. The vastness of the park stretched out before her, and for a moment, she felt a profound sense of belonging amidst the grandeur of nature. But then, the haunting cry echoed again, sending a jolt of fear through her. "Mia," it called, the sound wrapping around her like a chill. She staggered, nearly losing her footing as her mind raced. Was she truly hearing her own name? The wind? Or something far more sinister? "Stop it," she shouted into the void, her voice a mixture of defiance and desperation. "This isn't funny." But the mountains remained silent, unyielding. She felt an overwhelming urge to turn back, to flee from the unseen force that seemed to taunt her, but the climber in her pushed onward, determined not to let fear dictate her journey. With each step, the echoes of that cry gnawed at her resolve, a relentless reminder of something she couldn't quite grasp. She focused on her breathing, trying to steady herself, but the images of her own face twisted in fear flashed before her eyes. What if it was a warning? What if she was being drawn into something she couldn't escape? Mia reached the crest of the cliff, her heart pounding as she stood on the edge, the world sprawling beneath her. She took a moment to breathe, to ground herself in the reality of the moment, the beauty and terror of the wilderness coalescing around her. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt still and serene. But then, the cry came again, sharper this time, echoing off the cliffs with an urgency that drove a dagger of fear into her heart. "No," she screamed back, her voice swallowed by the wind. She stumbled backward, her mind racing, the world tilting on its axis as panic seized her. She turned and began to descend, her instincts kicking in. The wild was no longer a refuge, it had transformed into an unknown entity, filled with echoes and shadows that threatened to consume her. She could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on her, the granite cliffs seeming to close in as she retreated. "Just keep moving," she chanted to herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The path felt treacherous beneath her feet, each step requiring more concentration than before. The mountains had become a labyrinth of confusion, and she was lost within its depths. As she hurried down the trail, the echoes of her own voice mingled with the cries of the wild, creating a cacophony that rattled her. Mia pushed through the fear, desperation igniting her resolve. The wilderness was not an enemy, it was a mirror reflecting her own inner turmoil, and she would face it head-on. With the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Mia finally reached a clearing. She paused, her chest heaving, and took a moment to collect herself. The echoes had faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife settling in for the night. "I'm okay," she muttered, though her voice trembled slightly. She glanced around the clearing, her senses heightened, but the shadows seemed to recede. The wilderness was quiet now, as if holding its breath, and Mia felt a flicker of hope amidst the lingering fear. But deep down, she knew that the echoes would haunt her. Something within her had shifted, and she could no longer ignore the deeper truths that lay just beneath the surface. The wilderness had revealed a part of herself she had long buried, a connection to her own fears that she could no longer escape. With the stars beginning to twinkle above, Mia took one last look at the mountain before retreating to her tent, the weight of the world settling on her shoulders once more. She would have to confront what lay ahead, not just in the wild, but within herself. The echoes in the wilderness were only the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the rugged terrain of Glacier National Park. Mia adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the weight of her gear settle comfortably against her back. She had managed to shake off the lingering dread from the day before, when the haunting cry echoed through the wilderness, chilling her to the bone. Rationality had prevailed, she told herself. It was just the wind, just her mind playing tricks on her in this vast expanse of solitude. But as she started her ascent once more, the memory of that sound loomed like a specter, whispering doubts into the corners of her mind. Mia approached the cliffside, her hands brushing against the rough surface of the rock. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, but beneath that freshness lay a tension, a palpable silence that seemed to throb in harmony with her heartbeat. She inhaled deeply, trying to ground herself. "You've got this," she muttered to herself, her voice barely breaking the stillness. "It's just another climb." With a determined grip, she began her upward journey, each movement fluid and practiced. The rhythmic sound of her climbing gear clinking together was a reassuring melody against the backdrop of nature's quiet. Yet, every so often, as she reached for the next hold, the memory of the cry would invade her thoughts, twisting her focus. She could almost hear it again, a desperate plea echoing through the trees, her own voice laced with panic. No, it was just the wind, she reminded herself, stifling the unwelcome thoughts and concentrating on the rock face before her. As she climbed higher, the views began to unfurl around her, breathtaking and wild. The mountains stood majestically against the sky, their peaks dusted with snow, and the valleys stretched below like a patchwork quilt. For a moment, Mia allowed herself to bask in the beauty, the solitude of the wilderness washing over her like a soothing balm. It was moments like this that reminded her why she loved climbing, why she craved the heights and the challenges they presented. She was an adventurer, a conqueror of mountains, and nothing could shake that from her spirit. But as she reached the familiar ledge where she had heard the cry the day before, unease crept back into her mind. The world around her seemed to hold its breath as she stood still, peering into the dense forest below. "Okay, Mia," she said aloud, forcing herself to break the silence. "Just check it out. If there's something here, you'll find it." With a deep breath, she began to search the area, her eyes scanning for any sign, any clue that could unravel the mystery of that sound. The forest was thick, shadows playing tricks as the sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground in a mosaic of light and dark. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" The echo returned to her, mocking, as if nature itself was playing a cruel joke. Silence enveloped her once more, heavy and oppressive. Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. The air felt different, charged with a strange energy that made her skin prickle. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unease. "It's just your imagination," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. The longer she stayed, the more the shadows seemed to close in around her. Determined to shake off her apprehension, she turned her attention back to climbing, focusing on the rock face, the texture of the stone beneath her fingertips. Yet, as she continued her ascent, the echo of that cry curled around her like a vine, tightening its grip. It was as if the mountains were alive, breathing in tandem with her fears. By the time she settled into her tent that evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on her limbs, but sleep eluded her. The night was a cacophony of sounds, the rustling of leaves, the call of distant animals, and the ever-present wind, which howled through the trees like a mournful spirit. Mia lay wide awake, staring at the fabric of her tent, feeling the chills seep into her bones. Each rustle outside made her heart race, and the shadows danced just beyond her vision. Then, the visions began. Her mind conjured an image of her own face twisted in horror, the fear palpable and raw. The cry echoed again, reverberating through her consciousness, a ghostly reminder of her vulnerability. "No, no, no," she murmured, clutching her pillow, as if it could shield her from the memories. "It's not real. It's just a sound." But as the night dragged on, the images morphed, blending with remnants of her past. An old memory surfaced, uninvited, a childhood incident when she had been lost in a forest, the trees towering above her like giants, the shadows stretching out, whispering threats of abandonment. The sensation of being utterly alone washed over her, drowning her in a flood of anxiety. "I'm not alone now," she whispered into the darkness, willing herself to believe it. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, filtering through the thin fabric of her tent. Mia emerged bleary-eyed, the weight of her restless night still clinging to her. She packed her gear with a sense of urgency, driven by an unshakable need to confront what haunted her. The echoes of the wilderness tugged at her, a siren call she could no longer ignore. Determined, she retraced her steps to the cliff where she had first heard the cry. The forest was silent, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. As she reached the ledge, she took a moment to steady her breathing, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. "All right, let's do this," she said, her voice breaking the stillness. Again, she called into the void. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The words felt foolish and desperate, but she pressed on, hoping that somehow the echoes would reveal their source. She leaned out over the edge, peering down into the abyss, her heart racing with trepidation and hope. Nothing answered her but the wind, swirling around her, carrying the distant sounds of nature. Just when she thought she could bear the silence no longer, she heard it, a flicker of sound that sent chills racing down her spine. It was softer this time, almost like a whisper. "Mia," the voice was familiar yet foreign, echoing as if it came from both inside her and the depths of the wilderness. She stepped back, her mind racing. "What? Who's there?" The fear clutched at her throat, but curiosity propelled her forward. She felt drawn to the edge, her heart pounding in rhythm with the echo. "Show yourself," she shouted, her voice slicing through the quiet. The forest remained still, as if holding its breath. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp around her, but Mia stood resolute, unwilling to back down. "I'm not afraid," she declared, though part of her trembled at the uncertainty of her words. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound faded into the wind, leaving her standing alone, heart racing, mind swirling with questions. Was it her imagination? Was this some cruel trick played by the wilderness? Or was there something deeper, something buried within her that sought to emerge? Mia took a step back, her heart pounding. "You're losing it, Mia," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "Just breathe." She turned to leave, but the forest felt different now, alive with whispers and shadows that seemed to beckon her back. The echoes of her past and present intertwined, creating a tapestry of confusion and fear that she could no longer ignore. As she descended, Mia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the trees themselves were witnesses to her internal struggle. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her unprocessed emotions dragging her down. She paused, resting her hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. "What do you want from me?" she called out, her voice echoing into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening, and as she stood there, the forest seemed to close in around her, shadows swirling, whispering secrets she couldn't decipher. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a coldness that seeped into her bones. "Enough," she shouted, her voice breaking through the suffocating silence. "I'm not afraid of you." But deep down, she felt the cracks in her resolve beginning to widen. The forest remained unyielding, enveloping her in its silence, leaving Mia to grapple with the echoes of her fears and the shadows of her past. With each passing moment, the line between reality and the haunting whispers blurred further, and as she turned to make her way down the path, she knew she was embarking on a journey far more treacherous than the climb itself. Mia stood at the precipice of the steep cliff, her heart pounding in her chest as she peered down into the vast chasm below. The world around her was a breathtaking panorama of rugged mountains, dense forests, and the crystalline waters of glacial lakes shimmering like sapphires under the midday sun. She had always sought solace in nature, and Glacier National Park was no exception. It had drawn her in with its wild beauty and the promise of adventure. Yet, today was different. The mountains, which usually felt like a sanctuary, now loomed over her like ancient giants, their shadows stretching ominously across her path. The haunting cry for help had echoed in her mind since she first heard it, a sound that had both terrified and intrigued her. It felt like an echo of her own voice, twisted and distorted by the winds that howled through the crevices of the rock formations. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself, shaking her head as if to dislodge the thought. "Get it together, Mia." But the reassurance felt hollow, and the whisper of doubt lingered like a chill in the air. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and began her descent. The rocky surface was treacherous, each step requiring her full concentration. As she carefully maneuvered her way down, she felt the familiar thrill of climbing, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Yet, with every foot she descended, the feeling of unease grew heavier, like a stone lodged in her stomach. Suddenly, the chilling cry pierced the air again, closer this time, more urgent. Mia froze, her heart racing wildly. "No, no, no," she whispered, panic bubbling up inside her. The sound reverberated through the canyon, echoing from the walls like a malevolent specter. It was as if the mountains themselves were calling out to her, demanding her attention. Before she could process her fear, her foot slipped on a loose rock. Time seemed to slow as she felt herself tumbling downwards, the world spinning in a chaotic blur of earth and sky. She landed hard on a narrow ledge, gasping for breath as pain shot through her ankle. "Oh God," she cried out, her voice barely above a whisper. The air was knocked from her lungs, and for a moment, all she could do was lie there, staring up at the blue sky. It was serene and untouched, a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. As she caught her breath, the ghostly echo of her own voice faded, leaving behind a profound silence that felt oppressive and all-consuming. Then, just as she was starting to regain her composure, something caught her eye. Perched on a nearby branch was a bird unlike any she had ever seen. Its feathers were a vibrant mix of blues and greens, and it had a sharp, melodic call that resonated in the stillness. The sound was hauntingly similar to the cries that had frightened her earlier, yet it was undeniably beautiful. Mia propped herself up on her elbows, her curiosity momentarily overshadowing her fear. "What are you?" she murmured, the pain in her ankle momentarily forgotten. The bird tilted its head, as if considering her question, then let out another clear, ringing call. "Is that you?" she asked, half joking, half serious. "Are you the one calling for help?" With each note that escaped its beak, she felt a strange connection to the creature. It was as if it understood her turmoil, the echoes of her fear resonating in the very essence of its song. For a moment, Mia felt a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, beauty could emerge. The bird flitted from branch to branch, its movements graceful and fluid, and Mia couldn't help but smile. "Maybe you're my guide," she said softly, trying to ease the tension that had coiled tightly around her chest. But that moment of peace was fleeting. As she shifted her weight to examine her ankle, a sharp pain coursed through her, pulling her back to reality. She needed to get moving. Staying here wasn't an option. Gritting her teeth, she carefully assessed her surroundings. The ledge was narrow, but she could see a path winding down the mountain a short distance away. "Okay, Mia," she whispered to herself, "you've got this." With her heart still racing, she slowly crawled to the edge of the ledge and swung her legs over, testing her weight on the rocky surface. The bird continued to call out, its songs echoing through the trees, urging her onward. As she made her way down, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent her heart into a frantic rhythm. She felt the weight of the wilderness pressing down on her, as if it were a living entity, observing her every move. The air felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place, making her skin prickle. Suddenly, she stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling as it echoed back to her. "Is anyone there?" The silence that followed was deafening, amplifying her sense of isolation. She was alone, yet the feeling of presence lingered, a whisper in the back of her mind that refused to be dismissed. "Get a grip, Mia," she chastised herself, forcing her feet to move again. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The wilderness had a way of awakening old fears, of stirring memories long buried. As she continued her descent, the forest thickened around her, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Yet, despite the beauty surrounding her, a sense of foreboding hung in the air, as if something was waiting just beyond her line of sight. Mia paused, leaning against a sturdy tree to catch her breath. "I need to get out of here," she muttered, rubbing her sore ankle. "This place is getting to me." The bird, still nearby, let out another call, and she looked up to see it watching her. "Why do you keep following me?" she asked, half amused, half annoyed. "I'm not a lost cause, you know." It tilted its head again, its eyes gleaming with an intelligence that unnerved her. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," she reasoned, but the words felt empty. Pushing herself off the tree, she resumed her descent, each step more deliberate than the last. The path twisted and turned, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged. Just when she thought she might find an escape, a familiar sound echoed through the trees, the cry. Mia froze, her heart pounding in her ears. It was unmistakable, a cry filled with desperation, resonating through the forest like a siren's call. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the sound to go away, but it persisted, wrapping around her like a shroud. The urgency in the cry sent a jolt of adrenaline through her body, and before she knew it, she was sprinting down the path, the wilderness blurring around her. "Stop," she shouted, unsure if she was calling out to whoever, or whatever it was that cried for help or pleading with herself to halt the madness. As she ran, the underbrush snagged at her clothes, branches clawing at her skin, but she pressed on, driven by an instinct she couldn't understand. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, each breath a reminder of the chaos she was trying to escape. Then, in an instant, she stumbled again, this time falling to her knees, the sharp pain in her ankle flaring up as she landed hard. Gritting her teeth, she looked up, and to her shock, she found herself face to face with the same bird. It was perched just a few feet away, its eyes fixed on her, unblinking. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she cried out, frustration mingling with fear. The bird seemed to regard her with a piercing gaze, as if assessing her very soul. Just then, the cry rang out again, echoing through the trees with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. It was closer now, almost within reach. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. But the only response was silence, thick and suffocating. The bird took flight, soaring into the canopy above, leaving me alone on the forest floor. In that moment, something shifted within her. The realization that she was utterly alone sank in, and with it came the weight of her fear. She had come to the mountains seeking solitude, yet now she felt more isolated than ever, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. With a deep breath, she pushed herself up, determination flooding her veins despite the fear that clawed at her heart. "I have to get out of here," she whispered resolutely, taking a step forward. The path ahead was unclear, but she knew she had to keep moving. As she continued her descent, the echoes of her own voice mingled with the haunting cries of the wilderness, a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles were fought within. And as the shadows lengthened around her, Mia steeled herself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that the only way out was through. Mia sat on the edge of her bed, the sun filtering through the thin curtains of her small apartment. The weight of her recent experience loomed over her, a shadow that refused to dissipate. The echoes of the cry, which had once seemed like a thrilling mystery in the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park, now felt like chains binding her to a past she wished to escape. She rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the tension that had settled there since her return. "Maybe I just need some fresh air," she muttered to herself, rising from the bed and glancing at the climbing gear she had hastily tossed aside upon her arrival home. The ropes coiled like snakes on the floor, and the carabiners gleamed dully in the daylight. She had once thought of them as symbols of achievement, of conquering heights and fears, but now they felt like reminders of her unraveling sanity. Determined to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, Mia decided to take a walk around her neighborhood. The familiar streets felt both comforting and alien, as if they belonged to a different life. As she strolled, she spotted a local cafe, its patio filled with patrons enjoying the warm spring air. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to step inside. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and she ordered a simple latte, hoping it would ground her. "Hey, Mia," called out a voice from the corner of the cafe. It was Sarah, her friend from the climbing community. Sarah had a vibrant energy that always brightened Mia's mood. "Hey, Sarah," Mia replied, forcing a smile as she joined her at the table. "How have you been?" Busy with work, but you know me, always trying to squeeze in some climbing. How was the trip? Sarah's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm, though Mia could sense an undercurrent of concern in her tone. It was intense, Mia said, her voice trailing off as she stirred her drink absent-mindedly. I had a bit of a scare. What kind of scare? Sarah leaned closer, her expression shifting to one of genuine concern. Mia hesitated, the words catching in her throat. I heard something strange while I was climbing. It sounded like someone calling for help. But it was my voice. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she spoke, the memory of the cry flooding back to her. Your voice? Sarah echoed, her brow furrowing. That sounds terrifying. Did you see anyone? No, Mia replied, shaking her head. That's the thing. I thought maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks on me. But I can't shake off the feeling that it was something more. The silence between them grew thick with unspoken thoughts. Sarah finally broke it. Mia, you know that being out there, alone, can mess with your head. Have you considered talking to someone about it? Mia took a deep breath, the suggestion hanging heavily in the air. I've thought about it. I mean, I was planning to go back to therapy anyway. After Ethan, she stopped, her heart tightening at the mention of her twin brother, who had vanished during a climbing expedition years ago. The loss had left a gaping hole in her life, one she had never fully addressed. Maybe it's time to face that part of your past, Sarah said softly, placing a hand over Mia's. You don't have to go through this alone, you know. Mia nodded slowly, the weight of Sarah's words settling in her mind. After finishing her coffee, she left the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she had to confront her fears, even if they were rooted in the pain of loss. The following week, Mia found herself sitting across from Dr. Mitchell, her therapist. The office was warm and inviting, filled with soft light and the faint scent of lavender. Dr. Mitchell was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a calming presence. Mia, he began, studying her face, I understand you've had a difficult experience during your recent climb. Would you like to talk about it? Mia hesitated, the memory still fresh and raw. I heard a voice. It sounded just like mine. It was calling for help. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, the weight of the words heavy on her heart. Dr. Mitchell nodded, encouraging her to continue. And how did that make you feel? Terrified, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt like I was losing my mind. Like I was being haunted by something I can't explain. Let's explore that feeling, Dr. Mitchell suggested gently. Have you ever experienced something similar before? Mia thought back to her childhood, to the dark moments when she felt abandoned after Ethan's disappearance. When we were kids, Ethan and I would climb together, always pushing each other to go higher. But after he vanished, I felt lost. Like part of me was missing. I used to think I could hear him calling for me, but it was just silence. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his expression serious. Your climb might have triggered those past feelings of abandonment and fear. It's not uncommon for traumatic experiences to resurface in unexpected ways. Mia felt a lump in her throat as tears threatened to spill. I thought I had moved on from his disappearance. I thought I was strong enough to handle it. Strength doesn't mean not feeling pain, Dr. Mitchell said gently. It means recognizing and facing that pain, allowing yourself to grieve what you lost. Mia looked down, the tears finally cascading down her cheeks. I don't want to feel this way anymore, I want to be free of it. Freedom comes with acceptance, he replied. Let's work through these feelings together. You're not alone in this. The session continued, and as Mia poured out her heart, she felt a slight release with each word. The act of sharing her burden lightened her load, if only a little. But as she left the office, a sense of unease returned, lingering like a specter at her shoulder. That night, she slept fitfully, the echoes of her past intertwining with the haunting cries she had heard in the mountains. Visions of her childhood danced through her mind, her brother's laughter, their shared adventures, and the day he had gone missing. Each memory was tinged with sorrow, every laugh a reminder of the silence that followed. Why did you leave me, Ethan? She murmured in her sleep, tossing and turning as shadows flickered in the corners of her room. Even in the safety of her home, she felt the chill of abandonment creeping in. Days turned into weeks, and while her sessions with Dr. Mitchell continued to provide some solace, Mia found herself increasingly haunted by nightmares. The cries echoed louder, more frantic, pulling her deeper into despair. Shadows flitted just out of her line of sight, and Mia often caught herself glancing over her shoulder, convinced something was watching her. One evening, after another restless night, she decided to confront the shadows and the echo that haunted her. She rummaged through her camera gear, pulling out the photographs she had taken during her climb. Perhaps, she thought, there was something in the images that could provide clarity. As she flipped through the photos, a familiar sense of adventure washed over her, but the joy was quickly overshadowed by the haunting memory of the cry. She paused at a particular shot, one of her standing triumphantly at a cliff's edge, the majestic mountains stretching behind her. But something in the background caught her eye, a dark figure, indistinct but unmistakably there, lurking in the shadows of the trees. Her heart raced as she zoomed in on the image, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure was shrouded in darkness, and for a moment, her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be? She whispered to herself, fear clawing at her insides. Mia. Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts as she entered the apartment unannounced, a habit that Mia had long grown accustomed to. I brought dinner. Mia quickly hid the photos, her heart pounding. Oh, hey. You didn't have to do that, she said, forcing a smile while trying to mask the turmoil within. Sarah paused, her keen eyes studying Mia's face. You look pale. Are you okay? Just tired, Mia replied, her voice strained. It's been a long week. Sarah set the food down on the table, her expression softening. You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever is going on, I'm here for you. Mia nodded, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily on her. I've just been processing everything. The climb, the cry, and all the memories of Ethan. It's a lot to handle. Maybe it's time to go back to the mountains, Sarah suggested, her tone hopeful. You need to confront it, to take back your power. Mia hesitated, the idea sending a tremor of fear through her. What if I hear it again? What if it drives me over the edge? Or what if you find closure? Sarah countered gently. You won't know until you try. You're strong, Mia. You've conquered those heights before. You can do it again. As the evening wore on and they shared a meal, Mia felt the warmth of friendship seep into her bones. But as Sarah left, the shadows returned, lurking in the dim corners of her mind. She knew she had to confront her fears, but the uncertainty loomed large. Mia sat in the dim light of her living room, the flickering of the overhead bulb casting shadows on the walls. Her laptop was open in front of her, the screen filled with photographs from her recent trip to Glacier National Park. She leaned closer, her heart racing as she scrolled through the images, each one a vivid reminder of the breathtaking scenery, towering peaks, sprawling valleys, and the deep blue of glacial lakes. But it was one particular photo that caught her attention, a subtle unease creeping up her spine. In the background of a stunning shot of a mountain range, a shadowy figure lurked just beyond the trees. Was that there before? She muttered to herself, squinting at the image as if the mere act of focusing harder would reveal the truth. The figure was indistinct, blending seamlessly with the forest, yet it felt as if it was staring right back at her. A chill ran through her, and she quickly closed the laptop, shoving it away as if it were a snake poised to strike. The shadows in her mind had begun to grow, dark and expansive, creeping into her thoughts during the daylight hours and invading her dreams at night. Each session with Dr. Mitchell had peeled back layers of her psyche, exposing fears she had long buried. The cries she had heard during her climb had not only shaken her sense of self, but had also unearthed memories she had avoided confronting. Mia, have you considered that the shadows you see might not just be external? Dr. Mitchell's voice echoed in her mind, calm and probing. What do they represent for you? Mia had stared blankly at him, struggling to formulate a response. I don't know, maybe they're just shadows. She had wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off as a trick of her mind, but a part of her knew there was more to it. The shadows felt alive, as if they were manifestations of her unresolved trauma, tethered to the past in a way she couldn't fully understand. That night, sleep eluded her once more. She tossed and turned, the weight of her unease pressing down on her chest. The mountain trail photographs haunted her, each one a reminder of her vulnerability, of the moment when she had nearly lost her life to the wilderness. The cries reverberated in her mind, twisting and turning like a serpent, biting at her sanity. Get a grip, Mia, she whispered to herself, pulling the covers tighter around her. You're just tired. You need rest. But rest was a luxury she could no longer afford. The shadows danced just beyond her vision, and she could feel them lurking, waiting for the right moment to pounce. The next morning, determination washed over her like a wave. She had to go back to Glacier National Park. There had to be something she missed, something that would help her make sense of the echoes that haunted her. She packed her backpack, the familiar weight of the gear comforting in its own way. As she loaded her climbing equipment, she felt a sense of purpose surge within her. Maybe confronting it will help, she murmured, glancing at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes looked tired, but beneath the fatigue lay a glimmer of resolve. You can do this, Mia. The drive to the park was long and winding, the road twisting through dense forests and alongside rivers that sparkled in the sunlight. As she approached the entrance, a sense of nostalgia washed over her. Memories of her previous climb flooded her mind, the exhilaration of reaching new heights, the tranquility of the mountains, and the haunting cry that had shattered her peace. Once she arrived, Mia felt a mixture of excitement and dread. The park was alive with the sounds of nature, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just out of sight. She parked her car and took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs as she prepared to face the very place that had rattled her spirit. She made her way to the trailhead, retracing the steps she had taken on her fateful climb. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground beneath her was imbued with the weight of her memories. The trees loomed tall around her, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance just out of her line of sight. Okay, Mia. Just focus on the climb, she whispered to herself. You can do this. As she ascended, the familiar terrain gradually transformed into an echo of her past experience. The rocky outcrops and steep inclines greeted her as she navigated with care, each move deliberate. But with each step, the shadows in her periphery grew more pronounced. She could feel them tugging at her consciousness, pulling her back to moments of fear and uncertainty. "Get a grip," she muttered again, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused for a moment, gathering her breath and centering herself before continuing. The air was thin at higher elevations, but the challenge was invigorating. Finally, she arrived at the cliff where she had first heard the cry. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of towering peaks and sprawling valleys bathed in golden sunlight. But as she stood there, the beauty felt distant, overshadowed by the weight of her memories. "Why did I come back?" she asked the empty air, her voice laced with frustration. "What am I trying to prove?" As if in response, the wind picked up, swirling around her and carrying with it a distant echo. Mia froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The cry, her own voice, filled the air again, haunting and desperate. It reverberated through the canyon, a chilling reminder of her vulnerability. "No, no, no," she shouted, clenching her fists at her sides. "It's just the wind. It's just the wind." But the echo persisted, intertwining with the rustling leaves and the distant call of a bird. The sound was unmistakable, a twisted reflection of her own fear. She felt the ground shift beneath her, and for a moment, she feared she would lose her footing, just as she had on that fateful day. "Mia, stay calm," she chanted, forcing herself to breathe deeply. "You're here to face it, remember?" With a surge of determination, she shouted into the vastness, her voice carried away by the wind. "I'm not afraid of you. Show yourself." Silence enveloped her, the only sound being the rustle of the trees and the distant chirping of birds. Her heart raced, and she felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread coursing through her veins. Suddenly, a flicker in her periphery caught her attention. She turned her head sharply, but there was nothing there, just the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Yet, she could have sworn she saw a shadow dart behind the trunk of a nearby pine. "Mia, stop it," she scolded herself. "You're just imagining things." But deep down, she felt the pull of something greater, a connection to the mountain that went beyond mere adventure. It was as if the very essence of the wilderness was reaching out to her, beckoning her to confront the darkness within. Taking a deep breath, she moved closer to the edge of the cliff, the wind whipping through her hair. The view was dizzying, and as she looked down, the valley stretched endlessly below, a tapestry of greens and browns. She felt small, insignificant against the grandeur of nature. "Why am I here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "What do you want from me?" The answer came not in words but in a sudden gust that swept through the canyon, carrying with it the echoes of her past. It was almost as if the mountains were alive, breathing with her, sharing her pain and fear. Mia closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. It was time to let go of the burden she had carried for so long. The shadows that haunted her, the cries that echoed in her mind, they were all part of a story she needed to confront. "Show me what I need to see," she murmured, her heart racing. "I'm ready." As she opened her eyes, the landscape before her shifted. The shadows morphed, revealing fleeting images, moments from her childhood, laughter mingled with tears, and the feeling of being lost in a world that felt too big. It was a kaleidoscope of memories, swirling around her, and she felt herself being drawn into the depths of her past. "Mia." A voice called out, familiar yet distant, echoing through the canyon like a ghostly whisper. "Ethan," she gasped, her breath hitching in her throat. The name reverberated in her mind, a connection she had long suppressed. But just as quickly as the voice had emerged, it faded into the wind, leaving her standing alone on the precipice. She felt the weight of the moment crashing down around her, the realization that she was not just battling her fears but confronting a truth that had been buried deep within her. "Ethan," she breathed, the name tasting bittersweet on her tongue. In that moment, the shadows began to recede, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. The wilderness was not just a place of fear, it was also a space for healing. She had come to the mountains seeking answers, and now they were beginning to unfold before her. As Mia stood at the edge, she knew that she had taken the first step toward unraveling the shadows of her mind. The path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, but with each breath, she felt herself moving closer to the truth. The Mia stood at the edge of the cliff, her heart pounding as the wind whipped around her, a wild symphony that both exhilarated and terrified her. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the rugged landscape of Glacier National Park. She had come here seeking solitude, a chance to escape the chaos of her life, but the echoes of her past loomed larger than the mountains themselves. As she looked out over the vast wilderness, the haunting cry she had heard on her first ascent pierced through her thoughts once again, reverberating in her mind like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It's just the wind," she whispered, trying to convince herself. "Just a trick of nature." But the trembling in her hands betrayed her conviction. The memory of that chilling sound, a cry that had eerily mirrored her own, was etched into her psyche. Mia had spent countless nights tossing and turning, haunted by dreams of her own face twisted in anguish, and now, standing on the precipice of that cliff, she felt the familiar sting of fear creeping back. Gathering her courage, she called out into the abyss. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The wind howled back, but no other voice answered. Silence enveloped her, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. Yet, beneath the silence, she felt a strange pull, an irresistible urge to confront whatever lay hidden in the shadows of her memory. "Ethan," she shouted, the name escaping her lips unbidden. The very mention of her twin brother's name sent a ripple of emotions surging through her. Ethan had vanished years ago in this very area, lost to the wilderness, swallowed by its unforgiving embrace. The search efforts had been futile, and the void he left behind had carved a chasm in her heart that no amount of climbing could fill. As the echo of her voice faded, she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a charged energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "No, this can't be happening," she murmured, shaking her head as if to dispel the shadows that danced at the edge of her vision. She was here to confront her fears, not to delve deeper into the madness that had gripped her since she returned home. But then, as if summoned by her thoughts, a voice rippled through the canyon, chilling her to the bone. "Mia," it called, and her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unmistakably familiar, yet hauntingly distant, like a reflection of her own. "Mia, help me, Ethan," she gasped, her heart racing. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning, illuminating the dark corners of her mind. It couldn't be, he was gone. He had been gone for years. Yet, as the wind carried the voice back to her, she felt an inexplicable connection, a tether that pulled her toward the edge of the cliff. "Ethan, where are you?" she cried, desperation clawing at her throat. "I'm here. I'm coming." She stumbled forward, her heart pounding, each beat echoing the rhythm of her fear. The canyon seemed to pulse around her, alive with the memories of what had once been, of the brother she had lost and the bond they had shared. Mia, the voice echoed again, clearer this time, resonating with the pain of longing and loss. I'm here. I've always been here. Mia's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, overwhelmed by the surge of emotions. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she cried out, "What happened to you, Ethan? Why didn't you come back?" The question hung heavy in the air, a plea for answers that had eluded her for so long. "I was lost, just like you," the voice responded, the sound weaving through the trees like a ghostly whisper. "I never wanted to leave you, Mia. I was scared of the darkness." Shivers coursed through Mia's body, and she clutched the earth beneath her, grounding herself in the reality of her grief. "But you left me," she shouted, her voice thick with anguish. "You disappeared, and I had to live with that. I thought I could escape it by climbing, by pushing myself to the edge, but I can't escape you." Silence fell again, but this time it was different. It was not just the absence of sound, it was a vacuum of understanding, a moment where the past and present collided in a single breath. "Mia," Ethan's voice returned, softer now, filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "You never had to climb to escape. You only needed to remember." Mia's heart raced as the weight of his words settled over her, and she felt a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. "Remember what?" she whispered, the question spilling out in a breathless rush. "Remember us," he said, his voice a fragile thread weaving through the fabric of her memory. "Remember the laughter, the adventures we had, the bond we shared. You were never alone, not then and not now." As his words washed over her, images flooded her mind, sun-soaked summer days spent exploring the woods, laughter that echoed through their childhood home, and the unbreakable bond that had once tied them together. Mia felt the shadows around her begin to dissolve, the weight of her grief lifting, revealing a path toward healing that had long been obscured. "I can't forget you," she said, her voice trembling as she spoke the truth she had buried for so long. "I've carried you with me, Ethan. Every climb, every step, I've worn your memory like a heavy cloak." "Let it go," he urged, the gentle insistence in his voice urging her to release the pain that had anchored her in the past. "You've grown, Mia. You've become so strong. It's time to embrace the light again." Mia closed her eyes, allowing the warmth of his words to envelop her. "But how? How do I let go of the darkness?" "By facing it," Ethan replied, the clarity in his voice cutting through the fog of her despair. "You have to confront the fears that have held you captive. They're shadows, Mia. They can't hurt you. Not if you stand tall." With a newfound determination, Mia opened her eyes and took a deep breath. She could feel the energy of the mountain coursing through her, filling her with a sense of purpose. "I will," she promised, her voice steady now. "I will face them." "Mia," Ethan said, the warmth of his spirit wrapping around her like a protective embrace. "You're never truly alone. I'll always be with you, in your heart." Tears streamed down her face, but now they were tears of release, tears of acceptance. "I love you, Ethan," she whispered, feeling the weight of her sorrow lift as the shadows around her faded into the background. "I love you too, sister. Now, go. Live your life fully." With one last look at the vast expanse of nature before her, Mia stood tall, her heart filled with the echoes of their shared memories. The mountains had taught her many lessons, but the most important one was that the past could be transformed into strength, and the shadows could be overcome. As she turned away from the cliff, a sense of peace settled over her, a balm for her wounded soul. She was ready to embrace the light, ready to climb not just the mountains outside, but the ones within. The wilderness was alive with possibilities, and Mia was determined to forge a new path, one that honored her past while embracing the beauty of her future. And with every step she took, the echoes of Ethan's voice became a gentle reminder that she was never truly alone. She carried the spirit of her brother within her, a guiding light illuminating the way forward. With each breath, she felt more grounded, more connected to the world around her. The wilderness, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had transformed into a sanctuary of healing, and Mia was ready to reclaim her life, one ascent at a time. Chris adjusted the straps of his backpack as he ambled along the winding trail of the Bridger Teton National Forest. Towering pines lined the path, their fragrant needles releasing the earthy scent of the wilderness. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor, a perfect backdrop for the captivating landscapes he sought to capture. As a talented wildlife photographer, Chris was always searching for that elusive shot, the one that would tell a story, evoke emotion, and celebrate the beauty of nature. With each step, he felt his excitement build. The sound of rustling leaves and distant birdsong filled the air, creating a symphony of nature that energized him. He paused occasionally to snap photos, carefully framing the vibrant greens of ferns against the rugged bark of ancient trees. Chris had brought his trusty camera, a robust Canon that had been his companion on countless adventures. He held it up to his eye, adjusting the lens as he captured a particularly striking scene, a sunbeam illuminating a patch of wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. "Perfect," he murmured to himself, grinning as he reviewed the image on his camera's display. He was grateful for this chance to escape the chaos of his city life, where deadlines loomed, and creativity often felt stifled. Here, in the heart of the forest, he could breathe deeply, letting the tranquility seep into his bones. As he continued deeper into the woods, Chris found a clearing that seemed to call to him. It was bordered by a small stream, the water sparkling in the late afternoon sun. He set down his backpack and began to survey the area, mentally mapping out where he would pitch his tent. It was the perfect spot, secluded yet accessible, with a stunning view of the surrounding mountains. He could already envision the photographs he would take at dawn, the soft light illuminating the peaks in hues of pink and gold. After a few moments of deliberation, he chose a flat patch of ground near the stream. He quickly unpacked his gear, setting up his tent with practiced efficiency. The sound of the rustling fabric and the clinking of poles echoed in the serene surroundings, a comforting rhythm that grounded him. Once the tent was secured, he arranged his cooking supplies and set a small campfire pit, gathering dry twigs and leaves, ensuring he had everything ready for the evening. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Chris kindled the fire, watching as the flames flickered to life, casting warm light and long shadows around the clearing. He settled onto a log, the crackling fire providing a sense of security as he pulled out his camera. With the twilight painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, he began to capture the transformation of the landscape. "This is it," he said aloud, the words barely breaking the stillness of the forest. "This is what I came for." He snapped photo after photo, lost in the moment, the worries of his everyday life fading away. Each click of the shutter felt like a small victory, a reminder of why he loved this work so much. As dusk deepened, the forest transformed. Crickets began to chirp, and the gentle rustle of leaves filled the air. Chris could feel the temperature drop, the coolness settling in around him like a soft blanket. He stoked the fire, adding a few larger logs, letting the flames dance higher to ward off the encroaching chill. Once he was satisfied with the fire's warmth, he took a moment to reflect. He thought about the stories surrounding this forest, the majestic wildlife that roamed freely, the legends of the Native Americans who once inhabited these lands, and the whispers of those who had ventured into the woods, never to return. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head as he recalled some of the local tales he had heard back in town. Just a bunch of campfire ghost stories, he muttered. Yet, there was an undeniable thrill in the air, an undercurrent of excitement that sent a shiver down his spine. He shrugged it off, convinced it was merely the chill of the evening. As the sky darkened, he prepared a simple meal, the aroma of beans and rice wafting through the crisp air, mingling with the scent of pine and smoke. He ate quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest, an owl hooting in the distance, the soft rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the steady trickle of the stream. "Life doesn't get better than this," he said to the night, a smile creeping onto his face. He finished his meal, cleaned up, and settled back beside the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker against the backdrop of the star-studded sky. With the fire crackling softly, Chris took a moment to pull out his notebook. He jotted down thoughts and ideas for his photography project, sketching out potential themes and concepts. The pages filled with his handwriting, the ink capturing the essence of his inspiration. He felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose. Just as he began to drift into thoughts of the stunning images he would capture at dawn, a sudden rustling noise outside his tent jolted him awake. Heart racing, he froze, instinctively holding his breath as he strained to listen. The sound was subtle yet distinct, like something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush just beyond the thin fabric of his tent. "Is someone out there?" he called out, his voice shaky despite his efforts to sound calm. Silence enveloped the clearing, the only noise the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. After a few tense moments, he decided to peek outside. He reached for the zipper, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled it down, the sound sharp in the stillness. Chris held his breath, the darkness outside seeming to swallow him whole. He leaned forward, peering out into the night, and his heart nearly stopped. A sea of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows, their luminescence cutting through the darkness like tiny stars scattered across the earth. Panic gripped him as he realized he wasn't alone. "Okay, just relax," he whispered to himself, forcing his breath to slow. "It's probably just deer or something." But deep down, he couldn't shake the unease that settled in his stomach. The eyes blinked, a few shifting closer to the perimeter of the clearing, and Chris could hear the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. He tried to convince himself it was harmless wildlife, but a primal fear began to take hold, urging him to retreat deeper into the safety of his tent. "Stay calm, Chris," he murmured under his breath. "You've faced wild animals before." Yet, this felt different. There was an intensity in the air, a weight that pressed against him. He pulled back into the tent, zipping it shut, his heart thumping wildly in his chest. He sat there in the dark, straining to listen, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, and he was the captive, surrounded by unseen watchers. Minutes turned into hours as he lay there, the darkness closing in around him, the glowing eyes still haunting the edges of his mind. The rustling continued, an eerie reminder that something was out there, watching and waiting. Chris grappled with his fear, replaying every survival instinct in his mind, but the night only grew heavier, the shadows deeper, as an unsettling silence enveloped the forest. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping to escape into sleep, but the image of those eyes lingered, a chilling reminder of the unknown that lurked just beyond the safety of his tent. In that moment, Chris realized that his love for nature and its wonders had been replaced by an overwhelming dread, an instinctive fear that would haunt him long after that night ended. As night deepened in the Bridger Teton National Forest, Chris felt a creeping sensation crawling up his spine. He lay still in his tent, listening intently to the symphony of nocturnal sounds surrounding him, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the faint murmur of the wind weaving through the towering pines. But amidst this natural orchestra, something felt off. The earlier calm had transformed into a palpable tension, an electric charge in the air that made his heart race. The rustling noise that had jolted him awake lingered in his mind, an echo of primal instinct urging him to remain alert. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the forest thumping along with his own, a reminder that he was not alone. Chris took a deep breath, the scent of pine and earth filling his lungs, grounding him momentarily. He could do this. He had spent years in the wilderness, capturing its beauty through his lens. Yet, here in this vast expanse of nature, fear gripped him like a vice. Tentatively, he reached for the zipper of his tent, his fingers trembling as he considered the darkness that awaited him outside. The flashlight he had placed by his side felt like a flimsy barrier against the unknown. Gathering his courage, Chris unzipped the tent flap, the sound of the fabric parting echoing in the stillness like a gunshot. Peering outside, his heart sank as he was met with a sight that would forever be etched in his memory, a sea of glowing eyes staring back at him from the shadows. They flickered in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of his flashlight like a constellation of ominous stars. Panic surged through him, and he instinctively pulled back, heart pounding wildly in his chest. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the rushing adrenaline. Chris squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, hoping that when he opened them again, the terrifying vision would vanish into thin air. But when he dared to look once more, the glowing eyes remained, unblinking and watchful. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the soft crunching of leaves as something shifted just beyond the reach of his light. He strained to hear, holding his breath, every instinct screaming at him to flee. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself that he was merely overreacting. "It's probably just deer or something harmless." But the instinctual part of his mind knew better. There was something unsettling about the way the eyes moved in unison, as if they were part of a larger entity, a collective force lurking just out of sight. As he remained frozen in place, Chris replayed every survival instinct he had ever learned. Should he shout, or would that provoke whatever was out there? Should he grab his camera and start taking pictures, as if that would somehow document the bizarre encounter? The thought seemed absurd, yet the photographer in him yearned for evidence. He finally decided to speak. "Hello?" His voice trembled, reverberating through the dark woods. The glowing eyes blinked, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shift in the shadows that sent a jolt of dread through him. A low snort broke the silence, echoing through the trees, and Chris's heart raced even faster. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, urging him to flee, yet he remained rooted in place, captivated by a morbid curiosity. The eyes seemed to draw closer, and he gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam shaking in his hand. "Is anyone there?" he called again, this time with a hint of bravado he didn't feel. The silence continued to stretch, thick and suffocating. He could almost hear the pounding of his heart in his ears. Chris's mind raced with possibilities. What if it was a bear? Or wolves? The thought of wild predators made his blood run cold. As time dragged on and the dawn approached, Chris felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. All his experiences in the wild, every lesson learned, seemed to evaporate in the face of this unknown fear. He longed for the comfort of daylight, when the forest would return to its familiar beauty, but the night felt endless. Just when he thought he might lose his grip on reality, the glowing eyes began to dissipate, retreating into the deeper shadows of the forest. Chris blinked, unsure if he was imagining it or if they were truly leaving. He strained to listen, hoping for any sign of what had been watching him, but only the whispering wind answered. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as he remained paralyzed, unsure of when it would be safe to emerge from his tent. The soft crunching of leaves had faded, replaced by the distant rustle of branches swaying in the breeze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first glimmers of dawn began to filter through the canopy, illuminating the world outside his tent. With the first rays of sunlight, a wave of relief washed over Chris, but it was tinged with lingering fear. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and slowly unzipped the tent flap once more. The forest was bathed in soft golden light, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Birds chirped cheerfully, and the rustling of leaves now felt welcoming. Chris stepped outside, squinting against the brightening sky. The camp was undisturbed, but as he scanned the area, his heart sank again. There, just beyond the clearing, was a herd of elk, their large, curious eyes blinking in the morning light. They were majestic creatures, their coats gleaming with dew, but the memory of their glowing eyes in the darkness sent a shiver down his spine. Just elk, he murmured to himself, trying to shake off the remnants of fear. But the encounter had left him unsettled, and he could feel a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He raised his camera, instinctively snapping photos of the herd as they grazed peacefully, trying to regain his sense of purpose. The click of the shutter was a welcome sound, a reminder of his passion. Yet, the thrill of capturing the moment was overshadowed by a profound sense of vulnerability. "Why do you have to be so damn scary?" he asked the elk softly, as if they could understand him. One of the females looked up, her large eyes meeting his, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a connection, a shared existence in the vastness of the forest. But as the elk continued to graze, Chris's mind drifted back to the night before, replaying the terror of those glowing eyes. After capturing several shots, Chris decided to pack up his camp early. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and the forest was alive with sounds, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like a shadow. He meticulously folded his tent, each movement mechanical as he fought to regain his composure. "Okay, focus," he whispered to himself, trying to push away the fear that had settled deep within. It was just a scary moment. Nothing more. He tried to convince himself, but the weight of anxiety bore down on him. As he packed away his camera gear, he could feel the thrill of his photography slipping through his fingers, replaced by the haunting vision of those eyes. By the time he hit the trail, the sun was fully risen, casting a warm glow over the forest that should have felt inviting. Yet every rustle in the underbrush sent his heart racing, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more times than he could count. Each snap of a twig felt like a reminder of the terror he had faced the night before, an echo of primal fear that refused to fade. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, trying to maintain a steady pace, but the forest felt different now, more menacing. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the once familiar paths felt alien and treacherous. As he hiked, Chris replayed the events of the previous night in his mind, the way the eyes had glowed with an unnatural intensity, the way they had seemed to watch him with a knowing awareness. He shook his head, trying to cast aside the creeping paranoia. It was an illusion, he told himself, just the darkness playing tricks on me. But deep down, he knew that it was more than just a trick of the mind. The forest held secrets, and he had stumbled upon something that had shaken him to his core. With every step, he felt the weight of that encounter pressing down on him, threatening to crush his spirit. As he reached the trailhead, the sun now fully illuminated the landscape. Chris paused for a moment, taking in the beauty around him. The mountains framed the horizon, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves shimmering like emeralds. But the beauty felt tainted, overshadowed by the lingering fear that had taken root in his heart. "Why did I come here alone?" he whispered to himself, the question echoing in the stillness. The wilderness had always been his sanctuary, a place where he found inspiration and solace. But now, it felt like a battleground, a place where fear had triumphed over his passion. As he drove away from the forest, the memories of the glowing eyes haunted him, a specter that would linger long after he left. The wilderness was no longer a refuge, it had become a source of dread, and Chris knew that he would have to confront this fear if he ever hoped to reclaim the life he had built as a wildlife photographer. The first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the dense canopy of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, filtering down in golden streams that danced across the forest floor. Chris lay in his sleeping bag, his heart still racing from the harrowing night he had just endured. He could still feel the weight of the fear pressing down on him, a tangible presence that clung to him like the chill of the early morning air. Slowly, he peeled himself away from the warmth of his bag, forcing himself to confront the reality outside the thin fabric of his tent. "Just breathe," he muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper against the stillness of the forest. He could taste the remnants of adrenaline on his tongue as he unzipped the tent flap. Gathering every ounce of courage, he stepped outside, the crisp air biting at his skin. As he emerged, the beauty of the forest enveloped him, momentarily distracting him from the night's terror. The tall pines stood majestically, their needles glistening with dew, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine resin. Yet, the memory of those glowing eyes lingered at the edge of his mind, a shadow that refused to fade. Chris took a tentative step away from the tent, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The sun had risen, casting a warm glow over everything, but his heart still raced with anxiety. He felt vulnerable, standing alone in the wilderness after what had happened. He took a deep breath, trying to ground himself in the moment. It was then that he noticed movement in the distance. A flicker of motion caught his eye beyond the small clearing where he had set up his camp. Chris squinted, forcing himself to focus. As the figures drew closer, he realized with a jolt of disbelief that they were elk, an entire herd, grazing peacefully in the soft morning light. "Just elk," he whispered, half to himself, half to the forest, as if trying to convince the lingering fear in his chest. The creatures moved gracefully, their dark silhouettes contrasting against the golden backdrop of the sunrise. Some of them raised their heads, their large, curious eyes scanning the area, and Chris felt a strange mix of relief and lingering apprehension. He reached for his camera, instinctively bringing it up to his eye. The lens zoomed in on the majestic animals, capturing their beauty in a way that made his heart swell. He could hear the soft crunch of grass beneath their hooves and the gentle rustle of leaves as they moved about, oblivious to his presence. "Wow, you guys are incredible," he said softly, more to himself than to the elk. He clicked the shutter, the sound echoing in the stillness. Each shot brought a thrill, their elegance, their power, the sheer grace of nature laid bare before him. Yet, with every click, the memory of the previous night clawed at the edges of his mind. After a few moments, one of the elk, a large bull with impressive antlers, turned to face him directly. Chris paused, the camera hanging loosely in his hands. Their eyes locked, and in that instant, he felt an unexplainable connection. It was as if the elk could sense his fear and was silently urging him to let it go. "Maybe you're just as scared of me as I am of you," he chuckled nervously, breaking the tension. The bull snorted, a cloud of vapor rising from its nostrils in the cool morning air, and for a brief moment, Chris felt a sense of camaraderie with the wild creature. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The herd began to drift away, their interest in him waning. Chris watched them go, a twinge of sadness washing over him. He snapped a few final photos, capturing their retreating forms against the backdrop of the waking forest. As the last elk disappeared into the foliage, Chris lowered his camera and exhaled a shaky breath. The beauty of the moment was undeniable, yet there was a heaviness in his chest that he could not shake. The thrill of photographing the elk was overshadowed by the shadows of the night before, and he felt a gnawing doubt creeping in. Could he continue to pursue his passion for wildlife photography after what he had experienced? Determined to reclaim his day, Chris busied himself with breakfast. He pulled out his camp stove, the rhythmic sound of its ignition breaking the silence. As he prepared his coffee, the comforting aroma wafted through the air, momentarily calming his nerves. "Just a regular day in the woods," he said aloud, trying to convince himself. "Nothing to worry about." He poured the steaming liquid into his cup and took a sip, feeling the warmth travel through him, igniting a flicker of hope. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Chris found it increasingly difficult to shake off the remnants of fear. The tranquility of the forest was a double-edged sword. While it offered solace, it also reminded him of the vulnerability he felt during the night. He finished his breakfast quickly and decided to take a walk, hoping the movement would ease his mind. As he walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of nature enveloped him, the soft rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the gentle whisper of the wind. He focused on the beauty around him, snapping pictures of wildflowers and the intricate patterns of tree bark. Yet, with every step, the memory of those glowing eyes haunted him, lurking just beneath the surface. "Get it together, Chris," he muttered, trying to shake off the anxiety that clung to him like a wet blanket. "You can't let one night ruin everything." But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, unease began to creep back in. Chris found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching him again. That night, as darkness fell once more, Chris prepared himself for bed, but the familiar fear clawed at him. He crawled into his sleeping bag, the fabric feeling both comforting and suffocating. He tried to distract himself by reviewing the photos he had taken throughout the day, but the images of the elk only served to remind him of the fear that had gripped him just a night ago. "Just breathe," he whispered again, but this time the reassurance felt hollow. As he closed his eyes, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. The nightmares came swiftly, invading his mind like a storm. He was back in his tent, the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating and oppressive. The rustling outside grew louder, more frantic, and he could feel the panic rising in his chest. Then, the eyes appeared, those haunting, glowing eyes, surrounding him, closing in, their intensity piercing through the shadows. "Please, no," he gasped, fighting against the terror that gripped him. The eyes blinked, unblinking and relentless, and he could hear the low growl of something lurking just beyond the fabric of his tent. Chris bolted upright in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding violently in his chest. He was drenched in sweat, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to him like a second skin. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness of the tent, illuminating the familiar shapes of his gear. "Just a dream," he whispered to himself, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. He lay back down, but sleep eluded him. Instead, he stared up at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet whisper of the wind. Hours passed, and Chris remained wide awake, haunted by the images that swirled in his mind. He tried to focus on the beauty of the forest, but the fear had woven itself too deeply into his thoughts. As dawn broke once more, he lay there, exhausted yet unable to find peace. The daylight crept into the tent, illuminating the familiar surroundings, but Chris felt a profound sense of loss. The trip that had started with such promise now felt like a prison, and the shadows of his fear loomed large over his heart. With the sun rising high, Chris knew he had to make a choice. Would he let this fear define him, or would he muster the courage to face it head-on? The forest held its breath, waiting for his decision. Chris sat in his small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life once vibrant with adventure. On the walls hung framed photographs that captured the wild beauty of nature, sweeping landscapes, a majestic eagle taking flight, and a close-up of a bear in its natural habitat. Each image told a story of exploration, fearlessness, and a profound love for the wilderness. Yet now, they seemed to mock him. The colors felt muted, the scenes lifeless. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something had shifted inside him, a dark veil that cast a shadow over his once boundless creativity. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The cursor blinked back at him, waiting for inspiration that refused to come. Chris had attempted to edit the hundreds of photos he had taken during his ill-fated camping trip in Bridger Teton National Forest, but each time he opened a file, the memories flooded back like a tide of despair. The glowing eyes, the sense of dread, the suffocating isolation of the night, it all gripped him with an iron fist. He sighed deeply, pushing the laptop away and running a hand through his tousled hair. "Maybe I just need a break," he muttered to himself, as if trying to convince not only his mind but also his heart. He turned to the window, peering out at the bustling city life below. People hurried along the sidewalks, their faces lit with purpose. He longed to be among them, to feel that sense of belonging, yet he felt like a ghost lingering on the periphery, detached from the world he once cherished. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Tom, a fellow photographer and a good friend. "Hey Chris. Planning a trip to the Tetons next month. You in?" Chris's heart raced at the thought of returning to the forest. A mix of excitement and terror coursed through him. He typed a quick reply, "Thanks, but I can't. Need some time to regroup." Moments later, a call came through. It was Tom, his voice filled with concern. "Chris, are you okay? You've been really distant lately. It's not like you to turn down a trip to the mountains." "I'm fine, Tom. Just busy with work," Chris lied, trying to sound casual. "Busy? You haven't posted anything in weeks. You love photography, man. Don't let this get to you. Come on, it'll be good for you. Just like old times." Chris felt a pang of longing at the mention of their past adventures. The laughter, the shared moments of awe, the camaraderie of fellow creatives in the wild. But the memory of the glowing eyes loomed large, a haunting specter that refused to let him go. "Yeah, I don't think I can handle it right now," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, but don't shut us out. We're here for you," Tom said gently before hanging up. Chris stared at his phone, feeling a sense of isolation wash over him again. He had become a recluse, retreating into a shell that once felt safe but now felt suffocating. He could no longer bear the thought of venturing into the wilderness alone. The echo of the rustling leaves, the snap of a twig, each sound reminded him of that night, the night he felt the primal fear that gripped him so tightly. Days turned into weeks, and Chris found himself avoiding anything that reminded him of nature. He stopped following his usual photography blogs and even unfollowed some of his favorite outdoor influencers on social media. His camera sat untouched in its case, collecting dust. The vibrant world of wildlife photography he had once inhabited felt like a distant memory, a life he had abandoned. One rainy afternoon, as he wandered through a local park, he spotted a group of campers setting up their tents under the shelter of an old oak tree. Their laughter echoed in the damp air, and Chris felt a flicker of nostalgia. He remembered how exhilarating it felt to be surrounded by friends, sharing stories around the campfire, the warmth of camaraderie brightening the cold nights in the wild. "Hey, you a photographer?" A voice broke through his reverie. Chris turned to see a woman in her early 30s, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a bright yellow rain jacket. She held a camera and was snapping photos of the campers. Yeah," he replied, his heart racing. This was the first time someone had approached him about photography in what felt like forever. "Awesome. I'm Sarah. I'm part of a group doing a little camping trip this weekend. You should join us. It'll be fun," she said, her enthusiasm infectious. He hesitated, the thought of camping making his stomach churn. "I don't know. I haven't really been out in a while. Come on. We could use an extra hand, and it's a great way to meet people. Plus, the fall colors are stunning right now. You get some amazing shots." Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement, her passion for the outdoors evident. Chris felt a tug of war within himself. Part of him yearned to reconnect with nature, to feel the earth beneath his feet and the wind in his hair. But another part, the part that remembered the terror of that night, held him back, anchoring him in fear. "I'll think about it," he managed to say, forcing a smile. "Fair enough. Just let me know," she called over her shoulder as she returned to her friends. Chris watched as they laughed and chatted, their energy a stark contrast to the solitude that had enveloped him for months. He took a deep breath, inhaling the damp scent of the earth and the fresh rain. It wasn't just the memories of his past that haunted him, it was the loss of something beautiful, something that had once defined him. Later that evening, Chris sat on his couch, his camera resting on his lap. He flipped through the photographs he had taken over the years, pausing in images that stirred his heart. The joy on the faces of friends, the thrill of capturing a fleeting moment in time, it was all there, waiting for him to reclaim it. But as he turned to the folder labeled Bridger Teton, a chill ran down his spine. The memories of that night surged forth like a tidal wave, drowning him in anxiety. "Focus, Chris. Just focus," he whispered to himself, trying to shake off the dread. Instead, he felt his heart race as the images of glowing eyes flashed in his mind, the fear overwhelming him. That night, sleep eluded him once more. He tossed and turned, the shadows of his nightmares creeping back in. In his dreams, he was back in the forest, the campfire crackling beside him, the stars shining brightly overhead. But then the rustling began, and he felt the familiar surge of panic as those eyes emerged from the darkness, unblinking, watching him. "No. Not again," he screamed in his sleep, waking in a sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, glancing at the time, 2:37 a.m. He took a shaky breath, trying to calm himself. The nightmares were relentless, each one more vivid than the last, dragging him back to that moment of paralyzing fear. He sat up, running a hand over his face, feeling the stubble on his cheeks. As the days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and restless days, Chris found himself spiraling deeper into isolation. He avoided the outdoors, his camera a constant reminder of his fear. Friends reached out, but he kept them at bay, convincing himself that he needed time to heal. Yet, in truth, he was terrified that he would never be able to face the wilderness again. One evening, he stood by his window, staring out into the darkening sky. The city lights twinkled below, and a sense of longing washed over him, longing for the freedom of the wild, for the rush of capturing a fleeting moment in nature. But the shadows of his past clung to him like a shroud, suffocating his spirit. Then, a knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. "Chris." "It's me, Tom." He hesitated but eventually opened the door. Tom stood there, concern etched on his face, holding a six-pack of beer. "I brought some drinks. You need to get out of here, man." "Not tonight, Tom," Chris replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Come on. Just one drink. We can talk about anything. Just get your mind off things," Tom urged, stepping inside and placing the beer on the table. Chris sighed, feeling the weight of his friend's concern. "I'm just not ready yet." "Not ready for what? To live? To enjoy life again?" "I get that you're scared, but you can't let fear control you, Chris." Tom's tone was firm, yet he softened as he continued, "You're a talented photographer. You've seen the beauty out there. Don't let one bad experience ruin everything. You deserve to feel alive again." Chris looked at him, his heart aching. "You don't understand, Tom. It's not just fear. It's a feeling of helplessness. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I was so close to something I couldn't control. It's terrifying." Tom stepped closer, placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. "I can't pretend to know what you went through, but avoiding it won't help. You have to face it, even if it's hard." Chris stood at the edge of the forest, the towering pines casting long shadows in the fading light. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil, a stark contrast to the chaos that had become his life since that fateful solo camping trip. He took a deep breath, inhaling the tranquility that surrounded him, and tried to shake off the lingering dread that had haunted his every thought. Today was different. He had decided to confront his fear, to reclaim the passion that had once fueled his career as a wildlife photographer. The photography workshop was nestled deep within the Bridger-Teton National Forest, an area that Chris had once considered his second home. The familiar sounds of the forest buzzed around him, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. But this time, he was not alone. The workshop group was a motley crew of aspiring photographers, each with their own story and reasons for being there. Chris felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as he approached the group, their laughter echoing through the trees. "Hey there. You must be Chris," a cheerful voice broke through his thoughts. A woman with tousled hair and bright blue eyes stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah, the workshop leader. We're all so glad to have you here." "Thanks," Chris replied, forcing a smile. He shook her hand, feeling the warmth in her grip. "I'm looking forward to it." As the group gathered around a makeshift campfire, Chris listened as they shared their photography experiences and aspirations. Each story was a glimpse into their passion, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. But as night descended and the campfire crackled, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness held something more sinister than mere shadows. "Tonight, we're going to do some night photography," Sarah announced, her enthusiasm infectious. "The stars are incredible out here, and I want you all to capture the beauty of the night sky." Chris's heart raced at the thought. Night photography had always been his favorite, but the memories of the glowing eyes in the darkness made him hesitate. He remembered the fear that had gripped him that night alone in the woods. What if it happened again? What if he was left alone with his thoughts, trapped in his own mind? "Chris." Sarah's voice broke through his reverie. "Are you with us?" He blinked, shaking his head as if to clear the fog. "Yeah, sorry. Just thinking." "Good. Let's grab our gear and head out." Sarah clapped her hands, and the group sprang into action, excitement buzzing in the air. As they hiked deeper into the forest, the path seemed to twist and turn, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Chris fell into step behind Sarah, who shared tips on capturing the perfect night shot. He listened intently, grateful for the distraction, yet the shadows seemed to grow thicker around him. He tried to focus on the present, but the memories of his past were like ghosts, whispering doubts into his ear. When they reached a clearing, the group set up their tripods, the sky a canvas of stars waiting to be captured. Chris took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air brush against his skin. He fumbled with his camera, adjusting the settings as Sarah demonstrated the techniques. His heart raced with anticipation, and for a moment, he felt the joy of photography return. "Okay, everyone, let's take our first shots," Sarah called out, her voice bright against the night. Chris raised his camera, framing the stars against the silhouette of the trees. He clicked the shutter, the sound echoing in the stillness. With each photo he took, he felt more connected to his craft, the fear of the past slowly fading into the background. But just as he began to relax, a rustling sound broke the quiet. He froze, his heart pounding. The noise came from the underbrush, a familiar sound that sent a chill down his spine. Memories of that night flooded back, the rustling, the glowing eyes, the overwhelming sense of dread. He felt the panic rise in his chest, threatening to overtake him. "Chris." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts again. She turned to him, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" He managed a nod, but his throat felt tight. "Yeah, just thought I heard something." "Don't worry. It's probably just a deer or something," she reassured him, but Chris couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. The darkness felt alive, the shadows closing in around him. He tried to focus on his photography, but the rustling continued, growing louder. It was as if the forest itself were taunting him, reminding him of his fears. He glanced at the group, who were engrossed in their own worlds, oblivious to his inner turmoil. The laughter and chatter felt distant, muffled by the growing sense of dread that enveloped him. "Guys, did you hear that?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" One of the other photographers, Jake, replied, looking up from his camera. "It's probably just an animal." "Relax, man." "Yeah, it's just nature," Sarah added, her tone light. "We're in the woods, remember?" "Right," Chris muttered, forcing a smile. But his heart wasn't convinced. The noise was different, more deliberate, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with unease. As he adjusted his camera, Chris caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a reflection of light. He squinted, his breath hitching in his throat. There it was again, a pair of eyes glinting in the darkness. Just like before. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his tripod. "Chris!" Sarah exclaimed, rushing over. "What's wrong?" "Eyes, in the dark," he stammered, pointing toward the tree-line. "There are eyes." The group fell silent, their heads turning in unison toward the shadows. Chris could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of concern and confusion. The rustling grew louder, and he could almost feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. "Maybe it's just a raccoon or something," Jake suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "Let's check it out." "No, don't," Chris shouted, the panic evident in his voice. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of his fears. "You don't understand." "Chris, it's okay," Sarah said gently, her eyes filled with compassion. "We're here together. You're not alone." But the shadows loomed larger in his mind, twisting and turning into the memories he had tried so hard to bury. The eyes were back, and with them came the overwhelming fear that had gripped him for months. "I can't do this," he whispered, stepping back from the group. "I can't. I need to go." "Wait," Sarah called after him, but Chris was already retreating into the depths of the forest, away from the group in the flickering light of the campfire. He dashed through the trees, branches snagging at his clothes, the sounds of the workshop fading behind him. The darkness was swallowing him whole. He didn't stop until he reached a small clearing, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. He fell to his knees, gasping for air as the panic surged through him. The memories of the glowing eyes, the terror of that night, consumed him entirely. He was back in that tent, helpless and alone, paralyzed by fear. "Why can't I escape this?" he muttered to himself, his voice cracking. Tears stung his eyes as he fought against the suffocating darkness. He had wanted to reclaim his passion, to confront his fears, but all he felt was despair. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke through his thoughts again, but this time it was different, a soft, gentle noise that seemed to beckon him. Chris looked up, his heart racing as he spotted a figure emerging from the shadows. It was not the menacing eyes he had feared, but a deer, its large eyes reflecting the moonlight with an innocence that disarmed him. For a moment, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The deer stood still, its head cocked to the side as if assessing him. There was no malice, no danger, just a creature of the forest, curious about the intruder in its realm. "See? It's just nature," Chris whispered to himself, realizing he had run away from what he loved most. The deer took a cautious step forward, and Chris found himself reaching for his camera, the instinct to capture the moment taking over. He steadied his breath, focusing on the creature before him. As he clicked the shutter, the sound seemed to echo in the stillness, a reminder that he was still a photographer, still capable of connecting with the beauty around him. The deer remained, its eyes reflecting the light of the moon, and for the first time in months, Chris felt a flicker of hope. He had come to the forest to confront his fears, to find inspiration, and perhaps he had found it in the most unexpected way. The darkness was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. He could face it, one step at a time. With renewed determination, Chris rose to his feet, wiping away the remnants of his tears. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it. The workshop, the group, even the shadows, they were all part of his journey. And he wouldn't. The moon hung high in the star-studded sky, casting a silvery glow over the Bridger Teton National Forest. The night was quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a stream flowing. Chris stood at the edge of the clearing, the cool air brushing against his skin as he peered into the darkness, heart racing from the memory of the glowing eyes that had haunted him for weeks. It had been a little over a month since that fateful night, and he had hoped that this photography workshop would serve as the healing salve he desperately needed. "Are you ready for tonight's shoot, Chris?" A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Jenna, the workshop leader, with her enthusiastic demeanor and a camera slung around her neck. "Yeah, I think so," Chris replied, though his voice was less assured than he would have liked. He forced a smile, but the anxiety churned in his stomach. "Come on, it'll be fun. Just think of all the amazing night shots we can get," she encouraged, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're going to capture the Milky Way tonight, and it's going to be unforgettable." "Right." Chris nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm. He had always loved night photography, capturing the essence of nature under the stars, but after the elk incident, everything felt different. The fear of the unknown loomed over him like a dark cloud, threatening to rain on his newfound passion. As the group gathered around the fire pit for a brief meeting, Chris felt his heart rate quicken with each passing moment. He listened half-heartedly as Jenna explained the night's itinerary, his mind wandering back to that night alone in his tent. The rustle of leaves had been a mere whisper then, but it had escalated into a cacophony of dread when those eyes appeared, unblinking and watchful. "Chris." Jenna's voice pulled him from his reverie. "You still with us?" "Yeah, sorry," he stammered, shaking his head to clear it. "What were you saying?" "I was just going over the plan. We're going to split into small groups for the night shoot. I want everyone to find their own spot and really focus on the stars." Jenna smiled, her enthusiasm infectious. "It's going to be amazing." "Sounds good," Chris replied, though his heart wasn't in it. He could feel the weight of his fear anchoring him down, and he knew he had to confront it. After the group dispersed, Chris wandered to a secluded spot by a babbling brook. The sound of water soothed him, and for a moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. He set up his tripod, aligning his camera to capture the vast expanse of the starry sky. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the restless thoughts that ebbed and flowed like the water before him. As darkness enveloped the forest, Chris adjusted his camera settings, focusing on the constellations twinkling above. The beauty of the night was mesmerizing, and he found himself lost in the moment, the fear slowly dissipating. He snapped a few shots, feeling a sense of accomplishment build within him. Maybe he could reclaim his love for photography after all. But just as he began to relax, a rustling sound echoed through the trees. Chris's heart plummeted. No, not again. He turned quickly, peering into the darkness, his breath hitching in his throat. The memories of the glowing eyes flooded his mind, and panic began to claw at him once more. "Chris." Jenna's voice cut through the night, startling him. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine." Just lost in thought, he managed, forcing a smile. "Come on, let's head to the other side of the clearing. There's a great view over there," she said, motioning for him to follow. Chris hesitated, glancing back at the shadows behind him. "Yeah, sure. Just give me a second," he replied, taking a deep breath to steady himself. As they walked together, Chris found himself sharing his thoughts with Jenna, the fear still creeping at the edges of his mind. "You know, I had a really weird experience a while back," he confessed, keeping his voice low. "What kind of experience?" Jenna asked, genuinely intrigued, as they reached the new vantage point. "I was camping alone, and I woke up to, well, let's just say a lot of glowing eyes staring at me. It was terrifying." "Wow, that sounds intense." Jenna's eyes widened. "What happened?" "It turned out to be a herd of elk, but I was so scared at the time," Chris admitted, running a hand through his hair. "Ever since then, I've been, I don't know, jumpy. It's like the forest is holding on to something, like a secret." Jenna studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You know, a lot of photographers have wild experiences out here. It's part of the job, I guess. But facing those fears, that's what makes us stronger." She smiled encouragingly. "You're here, and you're taking steps to push through it. That's huge." "Thanks, Jenna," Chris said, feeling a flicker of gratitude. They set up their cameras, and as the night deepened, Chris focused on the stars, letting the beauty wash over him. After a while, Jenna wandered off to check on other participants, leaving Chris alone with his thoughts. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, the only sounds being the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. He aimed his camera at the sky, capturing the vibrant colors of the Milky Way when suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again. Just a glimmer, but unmistakable. His heart raced as he instinctively turned toward the source of the light. There, among the trees, he saw a flicker of what appeared to be glowing eyes. Panic surged within him, but something else tugged at his instincts, a curiosity, perhaps. "Chris." Jenna's voice called out, breaking through the tension. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing. Just thought I saw something," he replied, trying to sound casual. But the urge to investigate was too strong. He felt a compulsion pulling him toward the darkness, and before he could stop himself, he began to walk in that direction. "Hey, wait up!" Jenna called, hurrying to catch up. As he moved deeper into the forest, Chris felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The glow flickered again, and he hesitated at the edge of an old, overgrown campsite. Abandoned tents lay scattered, their colors faded and lifeless, while old equipment was strewn about as if hurriedly left behind. Chris's heart raced, something felt off. "Chris, are you sure this is a good idea?" Jenna's voice echoed behind him, concern evident. "I don't know. I feel like there's something here," he admitted, stepping cautiously into the clearing. As he explored the remnants of the campsite, he felt a chill in the air, a sense of being watched. His gaze fell upon a battered journal lying half-buried beneath a pile of leaves. Curious, he picked it up, brushing off the dirt to reveal the faded cover. It belonged to someone named Marcus, a photographer who had documented his adventures in these very woods. Chris flipped through the pages, his heart sinking as he read the entries detailing Marcus's own encounter with the glowing eyes. "Jenna, you need to see this," Chris called out, his voice trembling. She approached, peering over his shoulder as he read aloud. The eyes were everywhere. "I thought I was losing my mind. They seemed to follow me, watching from the shadows. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong here, something beyond nature." Chris's voice faltered as he felt the weight of the words. He disappeared shortly after this entry. Jenna's eyes widened as she took the journal from his hands, flipping through the pages with urgency. "This is unsettling." Do you think it could be a coincidence? Chris shook his head, unable to dismiss the chilling connection. I don't know. But after my experience, I can't help but wonder if there's more to this forest than it seems. Something that makes it alive. A sudden rustle in the distance interrupted their conversation, and they both turned toward the sound, hearts pounding. The glow flickered again, and Chris felt a primal instinct kick in, the need to flee, to escape from the unknown. Let's get out of here, he urged, his voice low but urgent. Jenna nodded, a look of fear etched on her face as they turned to leave. As they retraced their steps back to the campsite, Chris could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on him, the night closing around them. He glanced back one last time, the eerie glow still flickering in the distance, and a sense of foreboding washed over him. Chris, are you okay? Jenna asked, concern evident in her voice as they reached the safety of the group. I'm not sure, he admitted, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. But I think I need to confront this fear, to understand what's really going on here. It's not just about me anymore, it's about protecting others who might venture into this forest. Jenna nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Then let's figure it out together. You don't have to face this alone. With a sense of purpose ignited within him, Chris realized that in the heart of California's Sequoia National Forest, the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, a heady mix that welcomed Lena as she stepped into the ancient grove. Towering sequoias loomed around her, their colossal trunks stretching skyward, each one a testament to centuries of endurance and growth. The sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor, and Lena could hardly contain her excitement. This was not just a research project, it was a pilgrimage to the giants of the forest, those living monuments that had witnessed the passage of time. With a notebook clutched in one hand and her trusty camera slung across her shoulder, Lena approached the nearest tree, its bark rough and gnarled beneath her fingertips. She could almost hear the whispers of history embedded in the grooves of the wood. Incredible, she murmured to herself, her voice barely above a whisper as if she were afraid to disturb the sacred silence of the woods. She flipped open her notebook, her pen poised to capture her thoughts. Lena, you've got to document everything, she reminded herself, recalling her advisor's words. These trees are more than just a study, they hold secrets we haven't begun to uncover. She began to write, her pen scratching against the paper, forming neat lines of observations about the tree's height, circumference, and bark texture. The thrill of discovery surged within her, igniting a passion that had driven her to this remote corner of the world. Time slipped away as Lena lost herself in her work, measuring and noting every detail. But as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor, a rustle broke the stillness. Lena paused, her heart quickening as she glanced around. The sound seemed to come from behind a cluster of trees, a soft, almost cautious movement that sent a ripple of unease through her. Probably just a squirrel, she muttered, shaking off the instinctive fear tugging at her. Still, curiosity gnawed at her, and she took a tentative step toward the sound. Hello, she called, her voice echoing slightly. The forest responded with silence, save for the distant call of a bird. Lena frowned, feeling a peculiar sensation, as if the trees were leaning in, their immense forms watching her with an unspoken awareness. She shook her head. Get a grip, Lena. It's just the forest. Dismissing the unsettling feeling, she returned to her campsite, eager to review her notes and prepare for the next day's exploration. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a blanket of twilight draping over the forest. As she approached her tent, a chill settled in the air, and Lena felt an odd prickling at the back of her neck. Something was off. She unzipped the tent and immediately noticed that her notes were scattered across the ground, pages flipped and rearranged as if a strong wind had swept through her camp. What the? She breathed, bending down to gather the papers, her mind racing. How could this have happened? She had made sure everything was secure before leaving. "Lena," a voice called from the darkness, startling her. It was Tom, the local ranger she had met earlier that day. He stepped into the faint glow of her lantern, his face etched with concern. "You all right?" "I saw your light and thought I'd check in." "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, something feels off," she replied, her voice shaky as she straightened up, clutching her notes to her chest. "I thought I heard something earlier, and now my notes are all messed up." Tom stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "The forest can play tricks on you, especially in the dark. It's easy to let your imagination run wild out here." His tone was soothing, but Lena could see a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Do you think it's just my imagination?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe," Tom said, though a hint of doubt crept into his expression. "But I've heard stories, strange things happen in these woods. Just keep your wits about you, okay?" Lena nodded, though his words did little to quell the unease settling in her stomach. "Thanks, Tom. I'll be careful." He lingered for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the darkening forest as if expecting to see something lurking just beyond the trees. Then he turned to leave, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Alone again, Lena tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. She crawled into her tent, the fabric rustling around her as she settled in. But sleep eluded her, the sounds of the forest unfurling into a symphony of whispers and rustles that echoed in her mind. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tent, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in around her. "Just the wind," she muttered to herself, though the reassurance felt hollow. Hours passed, and Lena found herself drifting in and out of a restless sleep, plagued by dreams of towering trees that loomed over her, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal fingers. When morning finally broke, the sun's rays pierced through the canopy, illuminating the forest in warm golden light. Lena emerged from her tent, the cool air invigorating her senses, yet there was a lingering unease tethered to her. She shook it off as she prepared to venture deeper into the woods, determined to immerse herself in her research and silence the growing paranoia. With her notebook and camera in hand, Lena set off on a narrow trail that wound through the sequoias. The beauty of the forest enveloped her, and for a moment, she felt a sense of peace. The ground was carpeted with fallen needles, muffling her footsteps, and the birds sang a cheerful melody that contrasted with her earlier fears. As she walked, Lena began to collect more samples, carefully documenting the diversity of flora surrounding her. "Look at this," she said aloud, her voice buoyed by the thrill of discovery as she pointed her camera at a cluster of wildflowers. The vibrant colors popped against the green backdrop, and she snapped several pictures, feeling a rush of satisfaction. But then, just as she was about to move on, the rustling returned, louder, more insistent this time. Lena's heart raced as she turned her head, scanning the trees. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice a mix of curiosity and trepidation. The forest remained silent, a stark contrast to her mounting anxiety. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter in her chest. "It's just the wind," she reassured herself again, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something hidden among the ancient trunks. Pushing her unease aside, Lena continued along the path, determined to focus on her research. But the feeling of being watched lingered, intensifying with each step she took deeper into the woods. She paused to collect more samples, her fingers brushing against the soft earth, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in a web of unease. "Stop it, Lena," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "You're being ridiculous." Yet as she turned to gather her notes, she caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye, a shadow darting behind a tree. "Hello," she called again, her voice trembling. No answer came, only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Her heart pounding, Lena quickly gathered her samples and notes, her movements hurried and frantic. She turned to head back to her campsite, but as she retraced her steps, the forest felt different. The trees seemed to loom larger, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like a labyrinth of shadows. The path, once familiar, felt foreign and disorienting. "Where am I?" she muttered, trying to quell the rising panic within her. She glanced around, her breath quickening. The whispers swirled in her mind, an echo of her thoughts merging with the sounds of the forest. "Get a grip, Lena. Just find your way back." But every direction looked the same, and the sunlight that had once guided her now felt dimmed, obscured by the thick canopy. As she pushed forward, she stumbled upon an unexpected sight, a patch of peculiar fungi clustered at the base of a tree, their vibrant colors striking against the dull browns of the forest floor. "Interesting," she mumbled, kneeling down to examine them. She reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing against its slick surface. A shiver coursed through her, but she dismissed it as mere curiosity. What were they doing here, so vibrant and alive among the ancient giants? As she collected a sample, the air around her seemed to shimmer, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she heard the trees whispering her name. "Lena." The voice was soft, almost melodic, sending chills down her spine. She jerked back, her heart racing. "Okay, that's enough for today," she said, her voice trembling as she hurriedly gathered her things. The forest was closing in around her, and a sense of dread that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. With her notes clutched tightly in her hands, Lena turned to make her way back, the feeling of being followed now unmistakable. She quickened her pace, her breath coming in short gasps as the shadows elongated around her. The trees seemed to shift and sway, their trunks bending as if they were alive, and her mind raced with fear. "Just get back to camp," she urged herself, but the forest felt like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Each Lena awoke to the unsettling chorus of the forest at night. The sounds were alien yet familiar, a haunting melody that seemed to echo between the towering sequoias. It was a cacophony of whispers, rustles, and distant calls that sent a shiver down her spine. She squinted at the darkness of her tent, the flashlight flickering ominously on her makeshift nightstand, a rock, polished smooth by time and weather. The beam sputtered, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters across the fabric walls, and for a moment, she thought she saw something dart past the entrance. "Get a grip, Lena," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. She rolled over, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around her. Fatigue weighed heavily on her eyelids, but sleep eluded her. Every rustle outside felt magnified, and the very air seemed charged with a tension she couldn't comprehend. Hours passed, and the shadows continued their eerie ballet. Lena finally succumbed to exhaustion, drifting into a restless sleep punctuated by fragmented dreams of trees swaying and whispering her name. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, a sentient being that watched her every move. Morning arrived with a muted glow, the sun barely breaking through the dense canopy above. Lena emerged from her tent, blinking against the harsh light. The forest was still, a deceptive calm settling over the landscape. She took a deep breath, the earthy scent of damp soil and pine filling her lungs, and steeled herself for the day ahead. Today, she would delve deeper into her research, gathering samples and documenting her findings. As she wandered through the towering giants, Lena's heart swelled at the sight of the ancient trees. Each one was a testament to resilience, standing tall against the passage of time. She reached for her notebook, ready to jot down her observations. "Okay, let's see," she murmured, flipping through the pages. The rustling leaves above seemed to respond, a soft whisper that caressed her ears. Height, approximately 250 feet. Diameter, around 30 feet at the base. Just as she was about to write more, a sound broke through her concentration, a soft rustle, unmistakably close. Lena's head snapped up, eyes scanning the undergrowth. She could have sworn she saw a shadow slip behind a colossal trunk, a fleeting glimpse of movement that sent her heart racing. "Hello," she called tentatively, her voice echoing in the stillness. The forest held its breath, and for a moment, nothing stirred. She dismissed it as wildlife, perhaps a deer or a squirrel. "Lena, you're just tired," she chided herself, shaking her head. "Focus on your work." Returning to her task, she collected samples, carefully labeling each one. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, creeping up her spine like a cold finger. She shook it off, attributing it to the isolation of the woods and her overactive imagination. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows that intertwined with the underbrush, she gathered her equipment and made her way back to the campsite. It was then that she noticed something strange. Her notes, meticulously arranged, were scattered and rearranged on her makeshift table. "What the?" Lena whispered, confusion washing over her. She had been certain she left everything in order. Had someone been in her camp? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She quickly scanned the area, half expecting to see a figure lurking just beyond the trees, but the forest remained silent, its secrets tightly held. With a growing sense of unease, Lena decided to turn in for the night. She built a small fire, the flames crackling and popping as they lit the air. It provided a semblance of security, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive in ways she had yet to understand. The night deepened, and the strange sounds returned. This time, they felt closer, more pronounced. Lena lay in her tent, heart pounding in rhythm with the growing chorus outside. It was as if the forest was trying to communicate, to share its ancient wisdom, but she was too terrified to listen. When dawn broke again, Lena was exhausted. She stumbled out of her tent, rubbing her eyes. The world around her was bathed in soft light, but the shadows seemed to linger, clinging to the edges of her vision. She needed to shake off this feeling of dread. Determined, Lena ventured deeper into the forest, hoping the sunlight would banish her fears. She followed a narrow trail, her boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The trees towered above her, their branches forming a natural cathedral that filtered the light into ethereal beams. As she walked, Lena stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a patch of peculiar fungi, its vibrant colors almost pulsating with an otherworldly glow. She knelt down, curiosity piquing her interest. "Fascinating," she murmured, pulling out her notebook again. "This could be a new species." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the soft texture of the fungi. In that instant, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, colors blending and swirling, and she felt a sudden, intense connection to the forest. It was as if the trees were breathing, their collective consciousness flooding her mind. "Whoa," Lena gasped, pulling her hand back. The sensation was overwhelming, both exhilarating and terrifying. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over her thoughts. What was that? Just a reaction to the fungi, she reassured herself, but the unease grew, gnawing at her insides. Continuing on, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. Lena spun around, but the path was empty, the trees standing sentinel in their silent watch. "Hello?" she called out, voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered her, thick and oppressive. She felt a chill creep up her spine, and the urge to flee surged within her. But she couldn't leave. She was a researcher, a botanist driven by curiosity. Lena pressed forward, her heart racing. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with humidity, and the shadows felt alive, shifting just out of her line of sight. Every so often, she thought she caught glimpses of movement, a fleeting shadow darting between the trees, but she could never quite grasp it. As she made her way through the dense foliage, Lena found herself in a grove of particularly ancient sequoias. Their massive trunks were gnarled and twisted, as if they had borne witness to centuries of secrets. She paused, taking in the grandeur, the history that radiated from each tree. "Wow," she breathed, stepping closer to one of the giants. "You must have seen so much in your lifetime." She placed her hand against the rough bark, feeling the life pulsing within. But as she leaned in closer, she felt a sudden coldness wash over her, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun. The whispers returned, a symphony of voices that seemed to swirl around her, rising and falling like the tide. "Lena! Lena!" they echoed, sending a jolt of terror through her. "Who's there?" she shouted, stumbling back. Panic gripped her as she backed away from the tree, eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The shadows seemed to stretch, elongating as if reaching for her. Just then, a figure emerged from between the trees. It was a man, rugged and sun-kissed, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. Lena's heart raced as he approached, a mixture of fear and relief flooding her senses. "Hey there," the stranger called out, his voice warm and inviting. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Tom, a ranger in these parts." "Lena," she replied, still catching her breath. "I'm a botanist studying the sequoias." Tom nodded, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "You're out here alone?" I needed to get closer to the trees," she said, her voice wavering. "But I've been hearing things. Strange sounds. I thought I saw something moving." The forest plays tricks on the mind," Tom said with a knowing smile. "You'd be surprised how many people report the same. It's easy to feel like you're being watched out here." Lena felt a chill run through her. "You mean, it's normal?" "Normal enough," he replied, his eyes scanning the trees. "But there have been disappearances in these woods. People who ventured too deep and never returned." "Disappearances?" Lena echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" Tom hesitated, his gaze distant. "Some say it's the forest's way of reclaiming what's hers. Others believe it's the fungi, causing hallucinations that lead people astray. You should be careful." A knot formed in Lena's stomach. The fungi she had touched. "I've seen some strange fungi back there," she admitted, pointing towards the clearing. It was glowing, almost pulsating. Tom's expression darkened. "That's not good." If you touched it, you might be experiencing side effects. Hallucinations, confusion, fear. It can warp your perception of reality. Is there a way to counteract it? She asked urgently, feeling the weight of dread settle over her. Best to get out of the forest for a while, he advised. The longer you stay, Lena sat cross-legged on the forest floor, her notebook resting on her lap as she stared up at the towering sequoias that loomed over her. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows that danced across the ground like playful spirits. She could feel the hum of the earth beneath her, a living pulse that resonated with her passion for botany. Each tree was a testament to time, their gnarled bark and sprawling roots a reminder of resilience and strength. But as she began to jot down her observations, a flicker of unease crept into her mind. A rustle echoed through the underbrush, sharp and sudden, pulling her attention away from her notes. Lena's heart raced. She squinted into the shadows, convinced she'd caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something darting between the trees. It's just the wind, she whispered to herself, shaking her head as if to dispel the thought. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to her, wrapping around her like a cold mist. She forced herself to focus on her work, collecting leaf samples and sketching the intricate patterns of the bark, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her concentration. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lena returned to her campsite. The fire crackled softly, a comforting sound in the growing darkness. She unpacked her gear, but her heart sank as she noticed her notes scattered across the table, the pages flipped and rearranged as if someone had rifled through them. What the hell? Lena muttered, her brow furrowing in confusion. She had been meticulous in organizing her research. She glanced around the campsite, half expecting to see a mischievous animal or perhaps a fellow researcher playing a prank. But the silence was profound, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves. That night, the forest was alive with strange sounds, whispers carried by the wind, the distant hoots of owls, and the rustle of unseen creatures. Lena lay in her tent, her mind racing. Sleep eluded her as shadows flickered just beyond the thin fabric. The flickering of her flashlight only added to her anxiety, casting elongated shapes that seemed to dance and sway, taunting her as she struggled to find rest. The trees loomed outside, their silhouettes dark and foreboding against the starry sky. As dawn broke, she awoke feeling disoriented, her heart still pounding from a night filled with unsettling dreams. She stumbled out of her tent, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. Seeking solace in the daylight, she decided to venture deeper into the forest, hoping to distract herself from the creeping dread that had taken root in her mind. It wasn't long before she encountered Tom, the local ranger she had met on her first day. He was clad in his uniform, a wide-brimmed hat shielding his eyes from the sun. Morning, Lena. What brings you out here again? He called, a friendly smile on his face. Just trying to collect more samples, she replied, forcing a smile back. The trees are incredible, but I can't shake this feeling that something's off. Tom's expression shifted slightly, the humor fading as he regarded her with concern. You're not the first to feel that way. This forest, it has a way of playing tricks on you. You'd be surprised how many people have reported strange occurrences out here. Strange occurrences? Lena raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. Disappearances, mostly, he said, his voice lowering as if the trees themselves were listening. Folks wandering off and never returning. Some say they hear voices calling them, luring them deeper into the woods. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. Voices? Yeah, Tom continued, like the trees are whispering your name. It's just folklore, of course, but you can't ignore the number of missing persons. Just be careful out here, Lena. The forest can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous if you let your guard down. As he walked away, Lena found herself staring after him, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself that it was merely a ranger's way of scaring off tourists. Yet, as she ventured further into the forest, the feeling of being watched intensified. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon a patch of peculiar fungi growing at the base of a massive sequoia. The mushrooms were vibrant, their colors almost iridescent in the filtered sunlight. Lena knelt down to examine them, her curiosity piqued. "This is fascinating," she murmured, reaching out to touch one of the caps. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface, a jolt of electricity surged through her, and the world around her shifted. The trees around her began to sway, not with the wind, but with a rhythmic pulse, as if they were alive and breathing. Lena's heart raced as the whispers returned, a cacophony of hushed voices calling her name from all directions. "Lena! Lena!" They echoed through the air, wrapping around her like a thick fog. Panic surged within her as she stumbled backward, but the forest felt like it was closing in, the very ground beneath her trembling as if it were a living entity. Desperate for clarity, she hurried back to her campsite, her mind racing with confusion. She tried to document her experience, but the words on the page devolved into frantic scrawls, the ink smudged by her trembling hands. "The trees, they're alive," she scribbled, her breath quickening as the reality of her thoughts began to blur with the madness creeping in. "I can hear them, they're calling me." That night, the hallucinations intensified. Lena curled up in her sleeping bag, her heart thundering in her chest. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind, intertwining with her dreams. She saw the trees shifting, their trunks twisting and contorting, faces emerging from the bark, their eyes hollow and haunting. "Join us, Lena," they beckoned, the chorus of voices merging into a single ominous tone. "We are waiting." When she awoke, her body was drenched in sweat, her mind clouded with disorientation. She blinked against the harsh light, the familiar surroundings of her tent feeling foreign. Panic surged as she pushed the flap open, expecting to find herself still in the forest. Instead, she was met with the sterile whiteness of a hospital room. Where am I?" she croaked, her voice hoarse. The beeping of machines filled her ears, and she struggled to sit up, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. A nurse entered, her face radiating concern. "You're in the hospital, Lena," she said gently. "You collapsed in the forest. You've been unconscious for 2 days." 2 days? Lena's mind raced, the memories of the forest flooding back in fragments, whispers, shadows, the strange fungi. I was studying the trees. The voices, the nurse nodded, her expression softening. "I know it's overwhelming, but you're safe now. Dr. Morgan will be here shortly to explain everything." Lena's heart sank as a sense of dread settled in her stomach. She could feel the remnants of her paranoia still clinging to her, the whispers echoing faintly at the edges of her consciousness. The forest had not released her, it still held her in its grasp, even from this sterile room. Lena lay in the stark white hospital room, the antiseptic smell mingling with the faint aroma of flowers, a stark contrast to the earthy scents of the Sequoia National Forest that still haunted her memories. The soft beeping of machines provided a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts, which spiraled like the branches of the trees that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. She twisted her fingers in the thin hospital blanket, her pulse quickening as the door creaked open. Dr. Morgan stepped inside, his expression a blend of concern and professionalism. "Good morning, Lena," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "How are you feeling today?" She hesitated, searching for the right words, but finding only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. Something is still out there." Dr. Morgan nodded, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "That's understandable. You've been through a traumatic experience." He paused, his eyes searching hers for comprehension. "I want to talk to you about your symptoms and what we've discovered. It's important you understand what's happening." Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry as she braced herself for the revelation. "What did you find?" "The hallucinations, the paranoia, the sense of being watched, it's all connected to a rare neurological disorder," he explained, his tone measured as he spoke. "It's caused by a fungus that you encountered in the forest. This fungus can affect your brain's perception, altering how you see and interpret reality." A chill crept down Lena's spine, and she felt as if the walls were closing in. "So, you're saying I'm not imagining things? The trees they were moving?" "Not in the way you think," Dr. Morgan replied, his voice calm yet firm. "The fungus hijacks certain neural pathways, distorting your perception. It can make you see things that aren't there, or feel as if the world around you is shifting. It's not that the trees were moving, Lena. It's that your mind was misinterpreting the signals it was receiving." She closed her eyes, picturing the towering sequoias, their massive trunks rising like ancient sentinels against the sky. The memory of the whispers, the rustling leaves that had felt so alive, flooded back. "But it felt so real," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like they were alive, watching me." Dr. Morgan leaned forward, his gaze piercing yet compassionate. "That's part of the disorder. It can create vivid sensations, almost as if the trees themselves were reaching out to you. It's a response your brain developed in reaction to the environment and the fungus." Lena felt a wave of nausea wash over her, and she clutched the edges of her blanket, desperate to ground herself. "But how do I fix it? How do I make it stop?" "We'll start with treatment," he said, his tone reassuring. "We'll monitor your recovery and help you manage the symptoms. Cognitive therapy can also be beneficial, allowing you to confront these distorted perceptions in a safe environment." The thought of therapy made her stomach twist. How could she face the memories of the forest, the nightmares that clung to her like shadows? What if I can't get better? What if it's still out there, waiting for me? Dr. Morgan's expression softened, and he rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We'll work through it together. It's important to remember that while the forest is a beautiful place, it can also harbor dangers, both real and imagined. Your fear is valid, but it doesn't have to control your life." Lena nodded, but the knot in her stomach tightened. She wanted to believe him, to trust in the possibility of recovery, yet the images of the forest loomed large in her mind. They were filled with shadows and whispers that threatened to pull her back into that dark place. What if I go back? What if I see the trees again? "Let's take it one step at a time," Dr. Morgan replied, his voice steady. "For now, focus on your recovery. We'll talk about returning to the forest when you're ready." After the doctor left, Lena lay back against the pillows, staring at the sterile ceiling as her thoughts churned. The diagnosis felt like a double-edged sword. It explained so much, yet it left her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest had always been her passion, her sanctuary. Now, it felt like a cage, its bars made of bark and roots, closing in on her with every passing moment. As days turned into weeks, Lena's nightmares escalated. Each night, she found herself back in the forest, the trees looming ominously, their gnarled branches reaching for her. The whispers grew louder, echoing in her mind like a sinister song. "Lena, come play with us, join us." She would wait gasping, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as she grappled with the remnants of her dreams. In the daylight, the hospital room felt suffocating, the bright white walls closing in around her. She longed for the fresh air and the scent of pine, yet the memory of the forest now felt tainted, forever altered by the shadows lurking within her mind. "Lena," a voice called softly one afternoon, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. It was Sarah, her best friend and confidant, standing in the doorway with a bouquet of vibrant wildflowers. "I brought you something to brighten up your room." "Thanks, Sarah," Lena replied, forcing a smile as she accepted the flowers. The colors seemed to mock her, reminding her of the beauty that now felt so far out of reach. "How have you been?" "Worried sick about you," Sarah admitted, her brow furrowing with concern as she took a seat beside Lena's bed. "I hate seeing you like this. I want to help you heal. Have you talked to the doctors?" Lena nodded slowly, the weight of her diagnosis pressing heavily on her chest. "They say it's a neurological disorder caused by a fungus. It's messing with my mind, making me see things that aren't real." Sarah's eyes widened, a mix of sympathy and disbelief washing over her face. "That sounds terrifying. But you're going to get through this, right? You're so strong, Lena." "Am I?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "I feel so lost. The more I try to understand it, the more it consumes me. I dream of the forest every night, and it's always the same. The trees, they're closing in on me, and I can't escape." "Maybe you need to confront it," Sarah suggested gently, her tone careful. "Find a way to face those fears. You've always been so passionate about nature. Perhaps understanding it more deeply could help you." The idea hung in the air between them, both alluring and terrifying. Lena's mind raced with possibilities, and she felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. "You think so? What if I could? I don't know, study the fungus. Learn how it works. Why not?" Sarah encouraged, her eyes lighting up. "If you're ready, it could be a way to take back control. Knowledge is power, after all." Lena considered her friend's words, the prospect of diving back into her research stirring something deep within her. "But what if I go back and it all comes flooding back? What if the forest is still waiting for me like it was before?" "Then you'll face it," Sarah replied firmly, squeezing Lena's hand. "You're not alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll figure it out together." As the days passed, Lena's resolve grew stronger. The hospital became a sanctuary for her thoughts, a place where she could take time to process her fear and grief. She read everything she could find about the fungus and its effects, immersing herself in research papers that described the bizarre neurological disorder she now faced. Each page turned was a step toward reclaiming her life, a small act of defiance against the trees that haunted her dreams. Lena began to sketch out a plan, mapping out her thoughts and feelings, trying to untangle the web of fear that had ensnared her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Morgan approached her with a proposal. Lena, I think you're ready for outpatient treatment. With support and therapy, we can gradually help you adjust back to the world outside. Her heart raced at the thought of leaving the sterile confines of the hospital, but the prospect of returning to the forest loomed large in her mind. What if I want to go back to the Sequoia National Forest? She asked tentatively. Dr. Morgan regarded her thoughtfully. If you feel ready, we can discuss it. But remember, it's important to take it slow. Your recovery is paramount, and you need to ensure you're prepared for what you might encounter. Lena nodded, determination flooding her veins. She would face the forest again, not as a victim, but as a seeker of truth. She would understand the darkness that had plagued her mind, and in doing so, perhaps she could find a way to reclaim her passion for the towering giants that had once inspired her. As she prepared to leave the hospital, Lena felt a mixture of trepidation and excitement. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would not let fear dictate her life any longer. With Sarah by her side, she would navigate the shadows, unraveling the mysteries of the forest, and Lena stood at the edge of the Sequoia National Forest, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The sun cast a golden hue over the towering trees, their ancient bark resembling the weathered pages of a forgotten book. Each tree seemed to whisper secrets of time, beckoning her to delve deeper into their enigmatic world. After her harrowing experience in the hospital, she felt a fierce determination to reclaim her life, to confront the shadows that had haunted her during her recovery. As she stepped into the forest, the air felt thick with a palpable tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The familiar rustling of leaves sounded more like a hushed conversation than the gentle embrace of nature. She had meticulously prepared for this return, equipped with her research materials and a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of fear. Yet, as she ventured further, doubt crept into her mind. What if the forest was not just a collection of trees, but a sentient being, aware of her presence and her past? Just focus on the data, she muttered to herself, clutching her notebook tightly. You're here to study the fungus, nothing else. But even as she spoke those words, she could feel the eyes of the forest upon her, observing her every move. Lena made her way down a familiar path, her footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles underfoot. The towering giants loomed above her, their massive trunks stretching toward the sky, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Each step felt heavier than the last, a weight pressing down on her as if the forest was conspiring to keep her from moving forward. The once comforting sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves felt eerie, almost mocking. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath hitching in her throat. A movement caught her eye. Was it a shadow darting between the trees? She squinted, trying to discern the shape, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The memory of her hallucinations flooded back, the trees whispering her name in a cacophony of voices. Shaking her head to dispel the thought, she resumed walking, but her heart raced with every rustle and crackle around her. Get a grip, Lena, she whispered, forcing herself to breathe deeply. You're a botanist, not a frightened child. Yet, the forest felt alive, a living entity that pulsed with a rhythm she could almost hear. She pressed on, determined to reach the site where she had first encountered the peculiar fungus. After what felt like an eternity, Lena arrived at the clearing where she had collected her initial samples. The spot was eerily unchanged, as if time had stood still. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting gentle rays onto the ground. But something was different. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, thick and suffocating. As she knelt down to examine the area, she noticed a patch of the same fungi she had encountered before. Its vibrant colors were striking, yet there was something unsettling about its proliferation. She reached out to take a sample, but a voice, low and haunting, whispered in her ear, "Leave it be." Lena whipped around, heart racing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence enveloped her. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves. She shook her head, chastising herself for letting her imagination run wild. "It's just the wind," she murmured, trying to convince herself. But as she collected the sample, her hands shook. A chill ran down her spine, and she felt as though the trees were leaning closer, watching her every move. "I'm just gathering data," she said aloud, as if the act of speaking could ward off the encroaching dread. "Just a research project." With the sample secure, Lena turned to leave the clearing, but something caught her eye, an old, weathered log protruding from the underbrush, partially hidden by weeds. She approached it cautiously, curiosity piqued. As she brushed away the foliage, her heart sank. It was a journal, its pages yellowed and frayed, filled with frantic scrawls and diagrams. "Research logs," she whispered, her brow furrowing. Flipping through the pages, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The entries detailed experiments on the very fungus she had touched, experiments that described its effects on human perception. Words like hallucinations, paranoia, and altered reality leapt from the pages, sending shivers down her spine. "What the hell?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened here?" The entries hinted at the dark experiments conducted by researchers who had come before her, each one more disturbing than the last. Lena's hands trembled as she turned to the final entry, written in a frantic scrawl, "The trees are alive. They know us. They're watching. Beware the whispers." Panic surged through her. She stumbled backward, the journal slipping from her fingers and landing with a soft thud on the forest floor. "No, no, no," she gasped, her mind racing. She had come to confront her fears, to understand the fungus, but now she was ensnared in the web of someone else's nightmare. Lena's breathing quickened as she glanced around, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on her once more. She had to get out, had to escape the suffocating grip of the trees that seemed to close in around her. The once familiar paths now felt like a labyrinth designed to ensnare her. "Get a hold of yourself, Lena," she admonished, forcing her legs to move. "You're stronger than this." She turned on her heel, retracing her steps through the forest, but the shadows seemed to elongate, stretching toward her like twisted fingers. Just as she thought she had found her bearings, a low growl echoed through the trees, reverberating in her chest. Lena froze, her heart pounding. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice shaking. No response came, only the rustle of leaves as the forest seemed to shift around her. With every step, the sensation of being watched intensified, as if eyes were boring into her back. "I'm just a botanist," she repeated under her breath. "I mean no harm." But deep down, she understood that the forest held secrets far darker than she could fathom. Finally, she reached a fork in the path, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. The journal's warnings echoed in her mind. "Beware the whispers." She hesitated, glancing down one path that seemed to beckon her with an otherworldly allure, while the other felt like a dark abyss. "What do I do?" she whispered, torn between the urge to flee and the relentless pull of curiosity. The forest was alive, and it wanted her to understand. But at what cost? Just then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a local ranger, Tom, his face lined with concern. "Lena, what are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice breaking through her reverie. I came back to study the fungus, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But I found something. There are logs, dark experiments. Tom's expression darkened. You shouldn't have come back here alone. This place, it's not right. You have to leave. But I can't just walk away. I need to know what's happening. Lena insisted, her voice rising with desperation. Tom stepped closer, his eyes scanning the trees warily. You don't understand. The forest holds memories, secrets that should remain buried. It's not just the fungi, it's something deeper. It knows you, Lena. His words sent chills down her spine. What do you mean, it knows me? Those who've been affected by the fungus, they don't just see things. They become part of the forest's narrative. It twists your mind, distorts your reality. You have to leave now, before it's too late. A wave of dread washed over Lena as she processed his words. But I can't. Not without understanding what's happening to me. Understanding won't save you, Tom said firmly, taking a step closer. You have to trust me. The forest is calling you back, but it's a trap, a lure. You need to escape before it's too late. Lena's heart raced, torn between the urge to flee and the insatiable curiosity that burned within her. The forest was alive, pulsing with secrets waiting to be uncovered, yet the warnings were clear. She felt the weight of the decision hanging in the air, the forest holding its breath as if awaiting her choice. Please, Lena. We can go together, Tom urged, his voice low and steady. I'll help you. You're not alone. For a moment, Lena hesitated, caught in a web of fear and desire for understanding. But the forest loomed around her, dark and unyielding. With a deep breath, she nodded, realizing that sometimes the bravest choice was the one to walk away from the shadows. Okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. Let's go. As they turned to leave, the forest seemed to exhale, the tension lifting ever so slightly. But deep down, Lena knew that the whispers would remain, echoing in the recesses of her mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond the trees. Lena stepped cautiously through the corridors of the abandoned research station, the air thick with dust and a sense of foreboding. The dim light filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, reminiscent of the swaying sequoias she had grown to both love and fear. Each step echoed in the silence, a reminder that she was alone, yet the hairs on the back of her neck prickled as if she were being watched. Her heart raced as she approached a large mirror that stood against the wall, its surface tarnished and speckled with age. With trepidation, Lena peered into it, expecting to see only her reflection. Instead, she was struck by a vision that made her blood run cold. The swirling shadows of the forest seemed to ripple behind her, as though the trees themselves were reaching out, beckoning her to join them in their eternal dance. She gasped, stumbling back, her mind racing with the memories of her hallucinations, the trees whispering her name, the ground shifting beneath her feet. Get a grip, Lena, she muttered to herself, forcing her breathing to steady. It's just your mind playing tricks. But the reflection in the mirror taunted her, and she felt her grip on reality slipping. Was she truly losing her mind, or was there something more sinister at play? Just then, a memory surged forth in her consciousness, a conversation with Dr. Morgan from her hospital stay. Asterisk, the fungus alters your perception, Lena. It intertwines with your neural pathways, distorting what you see and hear. Asterisk, the doctor's words echoed in her mind, grounding her momentarily. It wasn't the trees that were moving, it was her mind that had been altered, twisted by the very thing she had sought to study. "What have you done to me?" she whispered at the mirror, her voice barely above a breath. The reflection seemed to mock her, the shadows swirling more intensely, as if they were alive. She could almost hear them laughing, a cacophony of whispers urging her to succumb to the madness. But she refused to give in. Lena shook her head vigorously, determined to push back the darkness that threatened to engulf her. "I'm not afraid of you," she declared, her voice growing stronger. "You're just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the mind." As she stood there, resolute, her focus shifted back to the mirror, and she noticed something peculiar, a name etched into the frame. It read Dr. Elwood, and beneath it, a series of numbers, perhaps a date or a file code. Lena's curiosity piqued, and she leaned closer, tracing her fingers along the letters. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Suddenly, the memories came flooding back. Dr. Elwood had been one of the researchers in the forest before her, someone who had documented the effects of the fungus long before Lena arrived. She recalled the old files she had thumbed through at the hospital, the ones that spoke of strange experiments and unexplainable phenomena. Could he have known what was happening? She wondered aloud, her mind racing with possibilities. Did he experience the same affliction? Determined to find answers, she turned away from the mirror and began rifling through the dusty shelves of the abandoned station. Papers and notebooks lay strewn about, remnants of a time when the forest had been a subject of fascination rather than fear. As she dug through the debris, one particular notebook caught her eye, its cover worn but still intact. Opening it cautiously, she was met with Dr. Elwood's precise handwriting, documenting his findings with meticulous detail. His initial observations were fascinating. The peculiar behavior of the local fauna, the way certain animals seemed to avoid specific areas of the forest, and disturbing accounts of those who had gone missing. But what chilled Lena to the bone was the later entries, where he had begun to question his own sanity, paralleling her own descent into paranoia. Day 24, "I can feel the trees watching me," one entry read. "They whisper secrets I cannot understand. I fear I am losing my grip on reality." Lena's hands trembled as she read, each word resonating with her own experiences. "This is it. This is what I've been feeling," she murmured, realization dawning on her. The fungus had not only altered her perception but had also played with her very essence, intertwining her thoughts with the very heart of the forest. Just as she was beginning to comprehend the depth of the situation, a noise echoed through the station, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a soft rustling, barely audible, but it sent a wave of panic coursing through her veins. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered her, thick and oppressive. Lena's heart raced, and she felt the urge to flee, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as she turned to escape, a sudden clarity washed over her. The fear she felt was not just of the forest or the abandoned station, it was the fear of confronting her own mind, the darkness that had taken root within her. "I can't run forever," she whispered, steeling herself. "I need to face this." With renewed determination, Lena took a deep breath and turned back to the notebook, flipping through the pages until she found a diagram illustrating the neural pathways affected by the fungus. The intricate lines twisted and turned, resembling the very roots of the trees outside. It struck her then that the forest was not just a backdrop to her ordeal, but a living entity, intricately connected to her psyche. Suddenly, she recalled something Dr. Morgan had mentioned during her treatment, *, understanding your condition is the first step to overcoming it. Lena's heart raced as she realized she had the key to her recovery right here in front of her. "I need to map this out," she said firmly, her resolve hardening. "If I can understand how the fungus has altered my mind, I can find a way to combat it." With purpose, she gathered scattered papers and supplies, setting up a makeshift workstation in a corner of the station. She felt the urgency of time pressing against her, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. Hours passed as Lena pored over the notes, piecing together her findings with Dr. Elwood's research. She sketched diagrams, connected ideas, and wrote frantically, her pulse quickening with each revelation. The more she worked, the more she felt the fog in her mind begin to lift, clarity replacing confusion. "Lena, you're not just a victim, you're a part of this now," she whispered to herself, determination flooding her veins. "You have the knowledge to fight back." Just as she was beginning to feel a sense of triumph, the rustling noise returned, louder this time, echoing through the station like a distant thunderstorm. Lena paused, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is anyone there?" she shouted again, the weight of her fear threatening to overwhelm her. But this time, a voice responded, low and echoing, as if it were emerging from the very walls of the station. "You cannot escape, Lena. You belong to the forest now." She turned, every instinct screaming at her to run, but the voice held her captive, a sinister lure that both terrified and intrigued her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "What do you want from me?" The shadows around her seemed to thicken, swirling with a life of their own. "We want you to understand," the voice whispered, seductive and haunting. "You are intertwined with the pulse of the forest. Embrace it." Lena's mind raced. Was this a manifestation of her hallucinations, or was there something more tangible at play? "I refuse to be a prisoner of this madness," she shouted defiantly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I will not succumb." The shadows stilled for a moment, and then the voice returned, softer now, almost pleading. "You can't fight what you are. The forest has marked you, and in return, you hold its secrets." Lena felt a rush of energy course through her. "No," she breathed, a sense of clarity washing over her. "I don't want your secrets. I want my life back." With that declaration, she felt the shadows recoil, the oppressive weight lifting. The forest was not her enemy, it was a part of her, and by understanding it, she could find a way to reclaim her mind. As the shadows faded, Lena turned back to her notes, feeling a sense of purpose surge within her. She would confront the darkness, not just within her mind, but within the very essence of the forest itself. The trees were not her foe, they were the key to her recovery. With renewed determination, Lena began to map out her research, connecting the dots between the fungus, her symptoms, and the ancient wisdom of the forest. The final revelation settled within her, a profound understanding that the battle was not simply against the affliction, but a journey toward embracing the harmony of nature and self. And in that moment, standing amidst the remnants of the abandoned research station, Lena felt a surge of hope. She was not just a victim of the forest, she was its ally, a guardian of its secrets. The darkness that had threatened to consume her was merely a reflection of the complexities of life, and as she stood there, she knew she was ready to reclaim her place in the world.